The story kicks off in a bustling workshop where Bernie, a blonde-haired boy, was practically bursting with joy as his project finally rolled off the finish line. He figured this would make life easier for everyone, and right ahead of him sat a lamp with a glowing, colorful stone inside. Cliff and Lucille strolled up to see if Bernie had cooked up something new. Cliff quickly realized Bernie was a big name in town. People kept raving that he was a true pillar of support, and Lucille burst with joy as she hugged her little brother tight. Bernie figured it wasn't all that impressive. His dad pushed him to stand taller and feel proud, telling him he was the family's pride and joy. Joy exploded in Bernie. He heard it and couldn't stop smiling, like happiness just hit the gas. As a master magical tool engineer, Bernie swore, no matter what, to protect his beloved country and his family with everything he had. Family, meanwhile, in another world, far outside the timeline, a bone-tired man jolted awake as his smartphone alarm blared like a siren. Alarm blared and he had no choice. Another grind day was waiting at work. He kept grinding at work, even while it felt like nothing he did was for anyone. At the office, urgent orders kept crashing onto his desk non-stop. He couldn't help but wonder why he was still stuck there while everyone else rushed home. At home, he stayed up until midnight, grinding through every task he'd been assigned. To him, once his shift ended, he bolted out to catch the very last train. Just as he thought he'd made it in time, it pulled away like destiny's joke. Right as he climbed the stairs, sudden dizziness hit him out of nowhere. He caught a wrong step, stumbled, and went tumbling all the way down the stairs. While everyone nearby panicked, the man tried to push himself up, only to fail, inch by inch, as his awareness faded into nothing. He pushed on, and then it hit him. The finish was right around the corner. Right before he blacked out, a wave of childhood memories crashed in, him alone, building little worlds with blocks. Right after he was born, his parents died almost immediately, so he was swept into a care facility. The people around him were actually kind, but as he grew older, he watched other kids get adopted, each one leaving hope behind like it was fading fast. The pain of having no family in the world started to crush him day after day. Even after high school, he still felt this empty hole in his chest, working for a ruthless company that used him like a tool. And every day he couldn't stop asking, "What's the point of my life?" Life crushed in on him and tears poured down his face as memories came crashing back. He pushed through the darkness, straining the crawl toward the light, like he could reach the next life waiting after this one. He dreamed of being born into a loving family, someone who'd teach him how to care for others the way someone cared for him. As he lunged for the light, realization crept in, slow and chilling. He blinked awake and realized someone was calling him Bernie, and the sight of those chubby baby cheeks left him totally baffled. His mom leaned in and told him it was time to drink his milk. Milk. The main character stared at him like she'd missed something huge, then picked him up anyway, totally confused. His dad leaned toward Dorothy and asked if he could feed the baby, convinced their little one would love it. The main character tried to ask, "Am I in a hospital?" But all that came out of his mouth were tiny infant cries. He froze, unable to speak a word clearly, while a woman held him and he couldn't figure out why. Then Dorothy snapped that her husband, Scott, was the one who scared Bernie. As they dumped him onto the bed, the main character's eyes widened. This wasn't a grown man anymore. He was a baby now. Squirming in their seat while gulping milk straight from the bottle. He couldn't stop wondering, was he really dead, or just trapped in some nightmare? Everything around him felt strange, like he'd stepped into a world he'd never seen before. As he pushed deeper, it hit him. This couldn't just be here. It had to be another country, and the whole place felt like a dreamland. He swore he was dead, yet somehow he woke up as a baby in this wild, brand new world, and the terrifying question hit him. Did he really come back to life? Then it slammed into him that the man and woman standing right in front of him, and now, standing right in front of him, were his mom and dad. Suddenly, bam! Someone knocked on the door out of nowhere. Two kids burst in, yelling at the top of their lungs for their parents, screaming as they ran. When they lifted that shiny golden flower they'd just found, Dorothy pointed out it matched the exact shade of Bernie's hair. The kids told us they spotted it at a market stand, dug into their pockets, and scraped together every coin to buy it as a gift for Bernie. When the main character heard the kids call that couple mom and dad, his brain immediately screamed that they must be his older siblings. That flower was only one tiny gift among the pile they'd already received. Bernie's older sister leaned in close and demanded he pay attention. She froze in place, shot her hands up toward him, and whispered a blessing. Then light exploded into butterflies, swirling and dancing around her. As he soaked in this peaceful but electric scene, he couldn't shake the feeling his sister had just thrown a spell. Then she cast the final spell, declared she was finished, and wished Bernie a future packed with real, lasting joy. Dorothy and Scott froze in shock when they saw Lucille already pulling off blessing magic, and Lucille told them she'd been grinding for it the day before, just for Bernie. Her older brother Cliff snapped that she was being selfish just because she wanted to impress Bernie on her own, and insisted he wanted a chance to show off too. Lucille shot back that Cliff was great with a sword, but practicing indoors would be way too risky. Cliff told Bernie, "I'll show you my sword skills later," then swore he'd keep him safe no matter what. Lucille swore her magic could keep Bernie safe all on her own, but Cliff insisted he'd be the protector instead, while Bernie just lay cradled in Dorothy's arms. Space. Watching Scott's eyes, he slipped in and gently stroked the older kids' heads while they snapped and bickered, telling everyone just how amazing they'd turned out. They trade quick smiles, and their eyes lock like sparks in the dark. Cliff made it crystal clear he'd always be Lucille's wonderful big brother, no matter what, while Lucille urged him to soak up moments like this with grace. Because they were both so insanely skilled, Dorothy couldn't help but wonder if they'd lend a hand and help get dinner going. A crushing wave of emotions slammed into him, one after another. Over him, this was the kind of chaos he'd only ever seen from a distance before. Bernie finally stumbled into a real family, and once he did, he realized he wasn't alone anymore. Then it was more, and later, the whole crew piled into a trip to a brand new place. Bernie practically buzzed with excitement when Scott told him they'd head straight to the cathedral in the royal capital to judge Bernie's skills, so when Scott, the blacksmith with a workshop in town, said it was their first stop, they chose that plan and set out together. As Bernie stared at the landscape and listened to them argue about their work, it hit him. He wasn't just somewhere else. He was trapped in a whole different reality. Right in the middle of that quick pause, Cliff trained his timing, swinging that wooden sword like he meant it. He swung at the rock he'd planted as a target. Bernie shot his dad a quick look and blurted, "So what's my brother up to?" But Scott just said Cliff was locked in with his usual training. Cliff had a blade fighting gift that could light up a room, and he dreamed of one day packing his gear and roaming dungeons all across the globe as a real adventurer. Scott said it like a spark test. Lucille was born for magic, and she was already lighting up with real magical talent. Everyone had powers linked to their work, so both siblings trained every day to chase their goals. Bernie couldn't help but admire them, even with their youth. Then it hit him. His dad was a blacksmith, and with no one to run the shop, he had to step up. And Scott started grinning as he told how he forged Cliff's practice sword. Bernie tried to ask where the workshop was headed next, but all that came out of his mouth were helpless little baby noises. Scott was sure Bernie couldn't wait for that workshop. He kept pointing at it like it was calling his name. But then Scott swallowed his pride, apologized, and warned there were tons of dangers inside, so Bernie couldn't step in just yet. Bernie wanted to make it crystal clear he meant nothing by it, but the words tangled up in his mouth. Then Scott snapped at him, telling him to stop sulking. If the evaluation proved Bernie had a real gift for tinkering, they'd gladly bend the rules and take him straight to the workshop. He told everyone how much he hoped Bernie would choose the life he truly wanted. That shook Bernie into thinking hard about what job he could take and what powers he might actually have. Right then, Cliff's practice sword suddenly snapped clean in half. He snapped, and right then it hit him. He was crushed, because his dad had poured his heart into making it just for him. Bernie's stomach dropped when he spotted his older brother breaking down in tears. Years went by, and he wrestled with one burning question. Could he actually use that weird new power, something he still barely understood, to help? As he stared at the sword, weighing whether to fix it, a menu suddenly flashed right in front of him, and for a second he just couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. But it looked like he had options piled on every side, like a slick game screen showing him his next move. He suddenly noticed a weird thing called the Reincarnation bonus. When he stared at the fine print, a new skill flashed, improved repair, and it felt like the universe was handing him a reward for getting reborn. Born, then straight from the word repair, Bernie suddenly saw exactly what it could mean. Now that he was trapped in a magical world, he fully believed that fixing the sword for real was absolutely possible. He swept his eyes over the supplies he'd need and mentally prepared for what was coming. The screen flashed. One magic ore was the only thing standing between him and what came next. Bernie didn't have a thing like that. No way, no chance. Out of nowhere, Cliff's necklace suddenly blazed with light. He started making tiny sounds, just to yank his brother's attention right back to him. Cliff wiped his tears away and shot him a quick, trembling look. He cracked a little under the nerves, afraid to show his soft, vulnerable side, and Bernie caught it instantly, because his brother couldn't even see the sparkle from the necklace. That only doubled his belief that he had some kind of special power. He wasn't sure what he could pull off, but for a family that loved him that hard, he was ready to gamble on anything. Bernie snatched the necklace and fired his left hand toward the shattered sword. Cliff lunged to shove the sword out of the way. It rose into the air all on its own. Bernie clenched his focus, and the training sword was fixed in no time, and Cliff froze in shock. Just like that, Bernie's heart leapt, because the sword looked normal again. More, Cliff yanked the pinned sword into his grip, stared it down, and felt its strange, one-of-a-kind power hum through his hands. He lunged forward and smashed his sword into the towering training rocket. He rock-smashed it and split it in two like it was pure butter. The two brothers stared in disbelief. Cliff even turned toward the danger, frozen. He charged up to Bernie with pure excitement and told him he'd seen the whole thing and was sure that with Bernie backing him, he'd actually managed to cut that boulder down. Scott and Dorothy burst out of the workshop right after they heard the commotion and fired off a question. What's going on here? Scott's eyes locked onto a perfectly carved boulder. Cliff told everyone Bernie fixed his sword, and the very next moment he swung it hard to smash that rock to pieces. Scott ran his fingers over the sword's edge and flicked a quick glance at Bernie. Bernie still looked shell-shocked from everything that hit him the moment he tapped into his job's power. Scott slid the sword aside and strode right up to his opponent. His sons finally exhaled, knowing they were both safe. He calmed things down and told Cliff, "I didn't crack that rock by myself, so don't fall behind. Stay with your special training." At the cathedral, Scott greeted the priest with a big, genuine warmth. The priest stepped in and, before anything else, spilled out his thanks ahead of time. He was genuinely relieved to see him, asked how Dorothy was doing, and when Dorothy said she was fine, she made sure he knew how much she appreciated his care. Then the priest's focus snapped straight to Bernie, the real reason they'd come all this way. He made his visit, scooped up Bernie, and, good news, this kid looked perfectly healthy. Right as they stepped into the building, the priest leaned in and told them that this world ran on something called jobs. These roles laid it all bare, showing each person exactly what kind of work matched them, so they could tap into the powers tied to their job. If someone had real talent and put in special training, they could climb into truly extraordinary careers. Almost everyone got processed right after birth, because they had to be tested immediately to uncover what role fate was about to lock in for them. They burst into a room where a massive crystal ball loomed in the center. Midway through it all, the priest praised Cliff as a razor-skilled swordsman and Lucille as a powerhouse mage, and then everyone held their breath, wondering what role Joe Bernie would step into. He steered Bernie straight to the crystal ball, then urged him on. Go on, reach out and touch it. That same display from earlier suddenly popped back on screen, and the crystal ball gleamed so hard it almost stole the spotlight. Scott demanded to know what the priest had decided, and the priest finally answered. Bernie shot back that he worked as a magical tool engineer. He said it was way out of the ordinary, something he'd never seen before, and then he added that it was tied straight to Scott's blacksmith work, which is why Bernie was the perfect pick to take over the workshop. Still, Scott refused to force the issue. He was convinced Bernie needed to blaze his own trail, and as a dad, he vowed to back his kids no matter which way they chose to go. Lucille and Cliff were hit right in the chest by their father's words. Dorothy could suddenly tell just how wildly joyful Scott really was. Bernie suddenly caught something huge. Stepping into this world felt like a lifeline for someone who had spent too long feeling alone. He vowed to protect the happiness he shared with his family. He clenched his resolve in silence, vowing to become a top-tier magical toolmaker and forge his own strength to stand beside them. They backed each other, and then bam, one whole year passed, and Cliff finally leveled up. He sharpened his sword skills to a whole new level by training every single day. He was smashing rocks with a plain practice sword, like Scott had already picked him out and dragged him into an adventurer's life. But Bernie still had a ton to learn about the art of magical tool engineering. He practically got a couple chances to test his weird power, like fixing a shattered plate, but his family shut it down every time. Seeing his older brother pour his heart into it, Bernie finally understood. There was no rush at all. This day mattered just as much, because a family day was waiting for them. Scott chose the destination and the whole family crammed into a carriage to ride straight there. He said Lucille was about to begin at the academy, and everyone was going to miss her like crazy. Dorothy nodded and said that's why they were stealing this time together before she left. Yeah, Lucille was kinda crushed, but she powered through and made it work. Bernie remembered how his older sister had just turned 7. Sold. As the Grand Maid, she didn't need to slog through the Royal Academy entrance exam. She was already locked in, set to start next week. Weeks slid by, and at first her face lit up like she couldn't wait. But as she pulled away from her family, a heavy sadness clung to her like a bruise she couldn't stop touching. Family. This place was a boarding academy, so she'd only get to see them during those long, hard breaks. Bernie couldn't stop wondering if she was truly feeling alone. Cliff grinned and playfully ruffled Lucille's hair, lifting her spirits instantly. She showed up in a flash, slid into place with unstoppable grace, and flashed a smile so bright it practically lit the room. Mile. Bernie finally exhaled with relief, because for a moment, everything felt like it might be okay. At least. He had this wild little plan for later and was determined to stack a whole mountain of memories with his sister. Their family finally stumbled upon a calm lake, its water glittering like pure starlight. Scott told me that, back when he was an adventurer, he stumbled on a hidden spot right near the royal capital. He said the royal magic core was wrapped in a protective barrier that kept monsters out. Only the toughest, sharpest creatures could slip through now and even then they almost never dared to come near human towns. Bernie froze when he learned his dad used to be an adventurer. Dungeons and monsters sounded terrifying, but the idea hit him like a spark and pulled him in. Scott then leaned in and told Dorothy the plan. Give Bernie a charm, and he warned that Cliff needed a fresh one because the magic had completely drained from his old charm. Dorothy handed Bernie a charm that looked just like Cliff's old one, like a piece of the past returned in his hands. Scott said it was a protective charm forged from magical ore, and he figured Bernie would drag it back into action the moment he found it. Again, Bernie finally got what his dad meant, his special ability. After that, Scott played dumb and urged everyone to take a walk down by the lake. The whole family strolled around the lake, soaking in the calm like it was their own little paradise. They froze at the sight of a tiny squirrel, totally locked in, munching nuts like it had all the time in the world. They stumbled into a field bursting with flowers and made flower crowns together, petals flying as they laughed. Then they finally reached a fishing spot where Cliff and Lucille sprinted in to catch fish before they slipped away. Lucille's fishing line suddenly jerked in her hands, and then Scott and Cliff jumped in to help her reel it in. She yanked the line hard and reeled in a massive fish, thrashing in her grip. They fired up the grill and cooked it right then. Bernie practically drooled on the spot. Lucille grinned and told everyone it was the fish she caught. Then she basically helped Bernie finally see how awesome it was. Cliff told her she only landed the catch because he was there to back her up, and Lucille shot back that their dad threw in help too, but in the end, it was her hands that reeled the fish in. Bernie realized he had to lock in, no distractions, no getting pulled off course again. Then he couldn't hold back and blurted out how much he admired them, calling them absolutely incredible. He made it a point to shout that his older brother and sister were absolutely extraordinary. Lucille froze when Bernie suddenly found his voice so clearly, and the joy practically lit him up because he could finally speak his mind. Then Cliff stepped in, gushing that Bernie was incredible, and Lucille just stood there, stunned, for a beat. Dorothy gently tapped her on the back, feeling. Lucille's chest warmed with joy. Bernie called her his big sister right before he sprinted off to the academy. Lucille was grinning so hard it hurt. Then Bernie burst into the scene too. And Bernie burst with that joy, and in his heart he wished they. Once they finally finished eating, they vowed to make memories that would stick with them forever. Cliff asked his parents if he could grab Lucille and Bernie for a quick stroll, and Scott said yes, then warned him to stick close. The three siblings strolled shoulder to shoulder, moving like one unstoppable squad. Lucille remembered her dad introducing Cliff to an explorer, and her stomach flipped with the question of how that meeting ever played out. Cliff told them the rules were ruthless. He couldn't be an adventurer until he turned 13, and at just 9, he was still training under his mentor, so he had to hold off a little longer before he could dive into dungeons or chase real missions. Lucille caught the feeling right away, that it was basically like prepping to dive into dungeons. Cliff warned me dungeons weren't so simple to reach, because not every zone has the same safe boundaries as the one by the lake. Still, Lucille couldn't wrap her head around why he kept getting pulled toward places that were nothing but trouble. Cliff dropped the truth. There was a goal he was determined to crush, and then a second reason he kept buried deep. Lucille couldn't wait to dive deeper and learn even more. But he shut the conversation down fast, leaving her even more curious, while Bernie Grinda's older siblings clashed and bickered nearby. Then his eyes caught something lurking by the bushes. He felt something lurking in the shadows and snapped at his sibling to look before it struck. Cliff figured Bernie was just being curious, then told himself it was nothing more than an animal sniffing around. Suddenly, a colossal monster tore itself out of the shadows, and the whole world felt it. The three siblings froze in shock. A hulking wolf barreled in front of them, so huge it made every ordinary wolf look tiny. Bernie swore it was a beast, until he remembered the barrier built to keep monsters like that out. Lucille pulled Cliff aside and asked what to do next, and Cliff told her to stay right by his side. Plus, don't leave Bernie behind. Bernie, she snapped with anxiety the moment it looked like he was about to clash with the creature. Cliff promised he'd keep everything under control, then shoved her into action, grabbed Bernie, and run straight to their parents. Lucille panicked at the thought. She just couldn't bring herself to do it, because it would leave him alone. Bernie clocked Cliff's trembling legs and immediately started plotting how they could all break free together. The wolf lunged in without warning, and Cliff shot forward, trying to face it head-on. He pressed on, but the animal looked exhausted and snapped its gaze away. And hey, Bernie caught it too, and he instantly knew it wasn't attacking at all. It just looked like it was in pain. Cliff pushed Lucille to grab the chance and run, but she still refused to leave him behind. Bernie clocked it instantly. This wasn't some ordinary wolf at all. He remembered his father warning him that the barrier mostly slammed down on monsters, never the sharp, intelligent ones, or the monsters strong enough to overpower it, which made total sense why something like him could slip right through. And if they were smart, they'd figure out a way to reach it right then. Then Bernie's magic stone charm erupted with a blazing, intense glow. Closely, and the hovering screen instantly reacted to everything unfolding around them. He thought this was his one opening, and he grabbed it to escape the mess he was trapped in. He snatched up his scarf and fused it with the magic stone. A blinding flash tore through the room and grabbed the attention of his older siblings. As soon as Lucille's scarf quit glowing, confusion hit her hard. Like, wait, what just happened? Heard, Bernie let out sweet little baby noises, soft and harmless. And somehow Cliff caught on that Bernie wanted them to slap the scarf on the creature, and Bernie answered with even more baby coos, while Lucille fumed, ready to step in, terrified it might be a huge risk. But Cliff's nerves finally calmed down when Bernie stood there, because the monster wasn't even trying to threaten them. As Cliff closed in on the wolf, regret twisted his face as he admitted he'd drawn his sword on it before, and promised it, if it stayed calm, he wouldn't lay a hand on it. To prove he meant it, he demanded the wolf wear the scarf. The wolf sank into a low crouch, silent as the night. Cliff couldn't stop thanking everyone, and then he explained that the scarf he was wrapping around the wolf, his younger brother had made it. The wolf nodded along and called it pretty good, and Cliff practically glowed hearing it. Then the wolf straightened up, introduced himself as Alboros, the holy creature, and asked if they'd finally listen to his plea. Cliff tried to answer your request, then noticed something weird that stopped him cold. He and the others couldn't wrap their heads around it. This wolf had a voice, and it turns out it was magical all along. With the scarf making his words crystal clear, Alboros shot Bernie a look and demanded, "Tell me, was I right?" Bernie was grinning because his translator finally worked, but his curiosity was itching. What did that mysterious creature want? Lucille leaned in and asked Alboros if he was all right, clocking the distress all over his face. Albertus told them he wasn't feeling well, so he headed to the lake to recover, yet his body betrayed him, refusing to cooperate, and he begged if they had any potions on hand. Lucille figured it had to be some kind of magical poison, and Cliff couldn't help but pester her. What did she mean by that? Lucille called it a toxin that warped the magic inside a person. Then, little by little, it stole the wheel from their body until they couldn't control themselves anymore. She said magic poison could just pop up out of nowhere, or get stirred up by something nearby. Why, Cliff finally got how bad things really were, and Lucille pushed him to tell their father right away so he could alert the Royal Magic Corps immediately. Before she acted, she demanded Alboros stand frozen in place. Still, she pulled him into her arms and poured her magic over him, sealing his wounds and speeding his healing. Alboros flashed a grateful smile and told everyone he was finally feeling better. Cliff's jaw dropped when he saw her cast healing magic. Lucille admitted she hadn't mastered it fully, but she'd still learned the basics so she could step in when her family needed help. And Cliff couldn't help but tell her she was incredible. Alboros shot them a grateful smile and asked if there was anything they needed, anything at all, to repay their help. Lucille hurriedly invited the magical creature to stay with them, and Cliff and Bernie were completely stunned. Bernie figured Lucille's excuse sounded genius, until she just wanted one thing, an adorable pet dog waiting at home. The others just froze in shock, and Cliff couldn't help but notice that. They noticed something wild. Alboros wasn't a dog at all, and he had his own wants. To their shock, the idea didn't offend him one bit. He'd been hungry to learn what life among humans was like. Before long, the siblings begged Alboros to tag along, then turned to their parents and asked if they could take him home with them, while Scott shot a look at his wife to get her take. Dorothy blurted out yes, because she figured it would pull good attention to the workshop, but Bernie was totally stunned. His mom was about to turn a sacred creature into a mascot? Just then, Cliff started calling Alboros, short and sharp, Al. Now Scott's curiosity sparked into a full-blown obsession with the scarf Bernie had painstakingly crafted. He couldn't stop thinking that Bernie had busted his tail just to watch over his older brothers and sisters. Years later, he grabbed Bernie, hauled him into his arms, and poured out his gratitude like it couldn't wait a second longer. Gratitude hits, and with everyone on board, he finally knew. He had to welcome Al into the family, because Al said it was his way of showing them just how much he appreciated their support. From that day on, he swore to protect them with his whole life. Family first, no exceptions. Time kept sprinting, and their family kept growing until Lucille finally enrolled in school. Cliff kept pounding the practice field at school, sword in hand, drilling again and again. Bernie kicked things into gear and started sharpening his skills for real. They chased their own wild paths, side by side with one goal: turn their dreams into reality. In a sprawling mansion, word spread that the curse behind that ancient magic poison had finally been handled. But then strange signs popped up, whispering it could still come roaring back. They planned to roam the region using the Royal Magic Corps, and they went straight to Lord Zolan to get his permission. When Zolan heard the words magic poison, a grin snapped onto his face, like he'd just found his next target. One day, Bernie's dad shoved a quick delivery into his hands and promised him a magic ore if he got it done. And he shot Al an invite to join him. As they pushed onward, Al couldn't miss it. Bernie was buzzing like the prize was already in his hands. Bernie told me that magic ore was the one thing he couldn't live without. It powered his whole job as a magical tool engineer. Over the last few years, Bernie slowly started to realize just how powerful his role really was. It was the kind of stuff you could build with and fix with, and you couldn't just make anything with it. You had to meet the exact rules to create items with those special, unique features. The first test was all about recipes and their levels. He had to dig up the ones that showed exactly which ingredients and techniques he needed, and as he pushed farther in his work, fresh recipes unlocked. So every repair job he did boosted Bernie's level. The second requirement was magic ore. No matter how high he leveled up, he still had to get his hands on it to unlock those special abilities. Mining output crashed and magic ore prices skyrocketed, so getting your hands on magic ore became brutally hard. Sure, that extra cash helped, but Bernie still had a long road ahead before he could save up enough to buy it himself. And Al made sure Bernie knew everyone had already noticed just how strong his work ethic really was. The duo finally burst into the nearby top. Bernie swept the area with his eyes and clocked the exact spot where his delivery would drop. Once he wrapped up the job, he let it be. He shot Al a huge thank you for the help, then said, "Let's grab dinner," and Al instantly suggested they hit a place for T-bone steak. Bernie swallowed the cost. then decided to torch the savings he'd set aside for magic ore. They hurried into a restaurant, and a warm, friendly auntie greeted them with a big smile. Bernie picked an omelet rice combo with a T-bone steak, and the auntie said Dorothy would bring their food over. Dorothy poked her head out of the kitchen and grinned as she waved you over. Al let out a slow breath of relief when he saw she looked happier. Earlier, Bernie nodded because her health used to be shaky, but lately it was clearly getting stronger, and now he'd even heard she was the star of the diner. While he was thinking about it, he realized she looked healthier than ever. Because Al had finally become part of their family, he couldn't help but quietly wonder if some magical creature had slipped them a blessing. A blessing. Then Alan asked Bernie if something was wrong, and Bernie brushed it off like it was nothing, right at that moment. The diner auntie leaned in and greeted the new customer Cliff and a girl named Petty right there beside him. Eddie, Cliff blurted out that it was wild to run into them, then asked if Bernie was helping their dad again, and Bernie said he'd just finished. Petty said it had been a while, then tossed out an idea. Let's grab a meal together. Cliff figured Petty would grab the exact turkey burger he'd been craving, so he marched up to the counter to order. Bernie leaned in close to Petty and whispered, right in the middle of the order, like he had a secret nobody else could hear. He blurted out, "I'm sorry, I messed up our date." Petty snapped bright red and insisted it was totally fine. Day. When Cliff came back, ready to ask what she wanted to order, he froze at her flushed cheeks. Petty quickly told Bernie that she and Cliff were nothing more than friends. Cliff backed her up, his face set in a hard, serious stare. That whole thing crushed Petty's mood hard, and Al reminded everyone they were already 14 and part of Kegaru, the adventurer group. He figured young folks had to find ways to connect, but Cliff just totally missed the message. Then Bernie dropped the bombshell. Petty was Zach's daughter, and she was the leader. Zach loved his daughter with his whole heart, and he also truly cared about Cliff. Cliff even looked up to Zach like a real father, and maybe Petty saw Cliff as part of his own family too. Family. Then Bernie leaned over to his brother and grilled him about whether he was planning to hit an adventure later. Cliff cut him off and said, "We just finished gathering herbs. Now we're rushing back to the guild to file our report." Petty tried to blurt out that she'd pick up the magic next, but Cliff slammed his hand over her mouth and cut her off. And suddenly, a petty unease gnawed at him. Bernie was sure he'd heard her say magic or gathering, and he snapped a furious glare at his brother. Magic ore cost a fortune to buy, but if you went out and grabbed it yourself, you could score it for free. Once he found some, he could fire up the recipes he'd uncovered and level up his skills fast. He was about to ask his older brother a question, but Cliff barreled in and shut him down. Straight up, no. No, Cliff clocked it instantly. Bernie was getting ready to ask to tag along, and when it came, Bernie's spirits totally sank. Cliff told him that curiosity was awesome, then reminded him loud and clear that he was only 6 years old. Even without dungeon crawling required, Magic the Gathering still lets monsters crash the party, because you never know what you'll run into. Cliff was on edge, terrified something awful was about to happen, and praying their dad wouldn't find out. Petty grinned after kissing Cliff's hand, then told him to finally relax. And in a soft, steady voice, she promised Bernie she'd back him the whole way, right beside him like a big sister. She snapped back at Cliff, reminding him of Kajaris' rule that, so if anything weird popped off at the party, you had to report it to the leader, and that's why they ended up calling every shot. Cliff got the point from the guideline, but he still insisted Bernie wasn't the kind of guy who'd go hunting for adventure. Just then, someone swooped in with their food and swore, "This is so good." It was Dorothy. She shot a finger at Cliff and told him that. That cliff used to be his playground. He'd dash around it non-stop when he first started, remember? If he's that worried, then he should go watch over his brother himself. Zone. Cliff already caught it, like he'd seen it coming from the start. Dorothy pointed out that Scott used to be on Zach's team, and if Zach was cool with it, then Scott would go along too. She clasped Bernie's tiny hands and urged him on with fierce, steady encouragement. Pushed him to finally bear his true feelings. Bernie finally remembered why he needed that magic ore in the first place. It was the key piece fueling his rise as a magical tool engineer. He shot his mom a confident nod, like he already had everything under control. Then Dorothy snapped, "Let's hit the guild together first." Right away, they made a beeline for the Adventurers Guild. It was Bernie's first time ever stepping into that place. He grabbed control of his mind, forced himself to stay locked in, and waited for the leader's okay before he moved. Cliff yanked him into his plan, inviting him to meet at a nearby inn, Kagaru's secret HQ. He said starting out might feel intimidating, then told him to stay calm. Petty added that the leader could look tough and even gang leaderish, but that's not who he really is, while Bernie snapped that her words weren't exactly helpful. They burst up to the door in a blink. 2 young explorers went first, and the whole crew practically exhaled in relief and they returned safe and sound. Bernie's breath caught the moment he spotted the eye patch on the man standing right in front of him. He ran the kangaroo operation, and Zach Petty called him the kind of guy who always Freddy's, Freddits, and Zach drops the truth that the simplest stuff can hit the hardest. He then demanded to know the little boy's name. Bernie towered there as Zach leaned in, and Zach's eyes widened at how much he looked like Dorothy. Then Bernie proudly introduced himself. Cliff told him Bernie was his brother, and they'd come with a question for the boss. Zach leaned in and asked what kind of request they meant. Petty snapped at her dad to stop glaring at Bernie so hard it scared him, and Zach swore he wasn't scowling, then pushed the same demand again. Bernie yelled that he was teaming up with Cliff and Petty for a magic gathering adventure. Zach shot an eyebrow up and demanded, "Why? Why?" His eyes were blazing, and Bernie felt straight up intimidated, yet he still had to risk it and ask for approval. He pumped himself up, forcing courage to rise when fear tried to drag him down. Then he leaned in and told me straight up that he worked as a magical tool engineer. He set his sights on striking magic ore from this adventure, piece by piece, to level up his powers over time. He blurted out that he wanted to become a world-class magical tool engineer, and before the hype could fade, he hammered it into himself to stay loyal to his own promise. He blurted out that he'd do anything to help his family. Zach Grin walked into the room, and boom, every single person went dead quiet. He flashed a grin and gently stroked Bernie's head, whispering that he'd finally made it. Succeeded, Bernie's heart flooded with gratitude, and Zach told me his longtime buddy Scott always bragged about his kids and swore they'd make it, so when Bernie just showed that kind of trust, it hit hard and was already more than enough for him. Cliff and Bernie finally heard their dad say it, those proud words to them for the first time. Zach snapped that Cliff and Petty alone as parents still wouldn't cut it, then invited a young man named Joseph to join them. Zach said Joseph might be young, but the kid was pure talent, and he'd be their guide. He blared a warning, stay safe, or else. Later, the boys burst in and told their parents every wild detail of their adventure, and Scott realized Zach had already flashed the thumbs up. Bernie shot Scott a quick question. He wanted to expand, was it okay? But Scott couldn't shake the dread that monsters might come crashing in. Cliff swore he'd have his big brother's back if anything went wrong, promised he'd bring Bernie home safe, and begged his dad to trust them. Dorothy leaned into Scott and said, with relief in her voice, how amazing it was to see their kids thriving. Zach nodded, grinning like crazy, and realized just how fast they'd grown up. The next day, Scott leaned on Joseph hard and told him, "I'm counting on you," right before the kids took off. He pulled them into a warm hug, then gently pushed them forward like he was cheering them on. 2 boys flashed each other a grin and took off on their very first adventure. Adventure time! Joseph drove the carriage and told them they'd reach Rodney Valley in 2 hours, the place where the magical ore was waiting, and he urged everyone to grab a break while they still could. Cliff took that advice to heart. On their journey, Bernie suddenly spotted a big no-entry sign posted on the trail ahead. Al pointed at the trail and said, "This is the one that led us back to the place where we first met." Bernie figured it all came down to that cursed enchanted poison. Joseph told me that 5 years ago, when that enchanted poison was first uncovered in the forest, the Royal Magic Corps went full obsession, spending a whole year digging into every last clue. They said the trade routes were safe, but everyone still whispered that the forest and lake regions were getting poisoned. Bernie finally understood why those areas were locked down. Still, it was the very spot where he first met Al, and just thinking about it punched him with sadness. Before they knew it, the whole crew slammed into their destination. Joseph leaned in to tell the younger kids it was time to go grab the magic ore, and Bernie's excitement lit up like fireworks. But a shadowy figure just watched them from a distance, silent as death. Bernie stared across Rodney Valley, eyes wide with pure awe. He stared in awe when he finally uncovered where the magical ores were coming from. Joseph snapped the team to attention, warning that weaker monsters might slip in, and told everyone to stay sharp and on guard. Their first mission was to hunt down the ore deposit, and Bernie was all set to make sure it happened. He took care of that part because he already had everything lined up and ready to use. He yanked out a compass bracelet. Cliff couldn't stop thinking about how Bernie had stayed up past midnight grinding on a project, and how badly he wanted to know what it was. Bernie flipped the compass on, and a blinding beam of light tore through the darkness. He ripped forward in one single direction, pure petty spite blazing in the air. Petty stared at the glowing light, completely hooked, and wondered what it was meant to do. Bernie explained it was a special gadget that could sniff out magical ore and point to its exact location. He figured it'd give them a huge boost in their search. Joseph couldn't take his eyes off the tool. He was itching to test every single thing it could do. Bernie steered the team and followed that blazing glow, heart pounding as he hunted it down. They finally reached a place bursting with enchanted ore, like the ground itself was glowing with power. Door. Everyone's jaw dropped in pure shock, and Bernie crashed down, falling to a... He couldn't help but beam with pride. Every ounce of hard work he poured into handling that magic ore finally paid off. Joseph said the enchanted tool was super useful, then leaned in and asked Bernie if he could forge weapons too. Bernie shot back that his work had strict limits, but if they brought the right supplies, he could make it happen. Cliff confirmed Bernie forged that sword, and Joseph's eyes lit up with the sudden need to get one of his own. Once he found the site, he blazed with urgency and told everyone to sprint in and grab the magical ore fast. Everyone sprang into action, smashing the ground to dig up the ore. Petty lunged to grab a piece, but Cliff casually swatted it away. Joseph noticed, smirked, and chuckled, because that casual push from behind made her blush like crazy. With a wicked chuckle, Bernie and Al hustled together and hauled in a bunch of magic ore. Using Bernie's enchanted tool, they zoomed right into a whole new spot to explore without breaking a sweat. Joseph was blown away by how much they piled up in such a short time, because with this new tool, they didn't need those risky detection spells anymore, and he even said it could stack up against the Royal Academy's top experts in detection magic. Petty's logic burned hot. He figured Bernie's tools could let him muscle through most professions. And sure, Bernie ate up the praise, but the real question still haunted him. Could he actually live up to his older sister, Lucille? Lucille, Joseph snapped to it, saying Lucille was Cliff's sister and that Cliff had even paid her tuition, but Cliff tried to cut him off, and still came up too late. Bernie demanded to know what tuition even meant, because Lucille's costs were already paid in full. Cliff had to clear up the mess fast. Lucille was a scholarship kid, but that money didn't cover everything she needed. It wasn't some mountain of money to cover, but he still knew exactly how hard their dad was grinding to secure Lucille's future. Cliff craved to become a true adventurer right away because his family's money troubles couldn't wait. Bernie finally understood. The dream Cliff had been hiding its secret from Lucille for ages. Cliff leaned in and told Bernie, "Don't let it get you down, okay?" He told me he'd been dreaming of becoming the best adventurer on Earth, tearing into uncharted lands, hunting hidden treasures, and pulling people out of monsters' claws. And just thinking about it made his whole face light up. He treasured every moment with his family and vowed to keep everyone he loved out of danger because he was chasing both dreams with zero hesitation. He could rake in money fast and blow up the workshop's size, so Bernie stepped in and said he wanted to pitch in too. He swore he'd become the top magical toolmaker in the royal city and make sure his family never got left behind. Family? Cliff cradled him tight, holding him close like nothing in the world could tear them apart. The others watched him act like a full-on, caring big brother, right there for everyone. Then, Petty suddenly noticed something way off. Weapons were strewn across the ground, caked in dirt and abandoned like they'd been left mid-battle. She cried out in pain and demanded answers. Why were they left behind, out here in the middle of nowhere? She called Joseph over and demanded he go check it out. Joseph swore those were the leftover weapons, cast-offs from the folks who fought monsters and didn't come back. He figured those people might still be lurking nearby, and with all that magic they'd already grabbed, he urged them to get out fast. The second he barked the order for everyone to get out, the whole place erupted into motion. Al growled, sensing something lurking just out of sight nearby. Joseph barked orders for everyone to get ready, then yanked his sword free. Sword in hand, Cliff and Petty rushed up to join him the moment he stepped forward. Bernie stared in confusion, trying to figure out why they were acting so wildly out of character. Then bam! A gigantic, gorilla-like monster burst out and slammed the earth exactly where they'd been standing seconds ago. They barely dodged death and burst out before it could catch them again. And Al yanked Bernie by the arm and dragged him to safety in a split second. They all froze in shock as that raging monster roared straight at them like it was ready to tear the world apart. Joseph stared at it, heart pounding, terrified thoughts racing. Why was that creature lurking here? The monster started going on a rampage, smashing everything it could reach. Al barked at Bernie to jump onto his back because they had no time to waste. Joseph shot back that they'd take care of the monster themselves. He and the group shoved Al to get out, while they fought the beast themselves. The monster crumpled under heavy damage, but before anyone could breathe, it struck back with a brutal retaliation. The creature exploded forward and lunged at Joseph, its razor-sharp claws flashing toward him. Right then, he watched the monster's wounds stitch themselves back together. Cliff hurtled the monster's head in one bound, then screamed at the others to stop it from scrambling back to its feet. The monster locked eyes on him and slammed into action. It slammed him toward the edge of a cliff, and that's when everything tipped into a brutal little brawl. She tried to stand up for herself, but it didn't last. She got shut down fast. He lunged forward and smashed down, tumbling through the dirt like a wrecking ball. Bernie couldn't stop his nerves from spiraling, for both of them. Joseph hurled a smoke bomb at the creature, and in an instant its vision vanished into thick, swirling chaos. He ordered Cliff and Petty to snatch Bernie and Al and haul ass out of there. Forward, everyone froze in shock, and he barked, "Now listen, I need you to—" He raced toward the royal city to beg for help, then kept the monster pinned down, only letting it breathe when they came back. Petty begged them not to leave, swearing he wouldn't make it alone, and Cliff snapped in agreement, ready to jump in and help too. Joseph leaned in and told them, "Be wise, think smart before you move." He told them plainly, this was the elder's duty, to guard the little ones, so that's why the leader picked him to stay close and watch over them during nights like these. He shoved them forward before the smoke could vanish, and they had no choice but to listen. Joseph stepped up into the bay and squared off against the beast, alone. Everyone could tell he meant to die on his own, and Bernie felt it too. If they kept stalling, Joseph's resolve would crumble. Even so, Bernie couldn't shake off the urge to stand by his fellow soldier. A chunk of the cliff ripped loose and crashed down, sending... Then Bernie gets slammed with a storm of rocks tumbling down toward him. Al snapped into action and hurled himself between him and the crashing debris. He said that creature was no ordinary monster. If he even tried to fight, it would wipe him out fast, all while everyone stayed in danger unless he kept them safe. Safe for now, he turned to Bernie and demanded a verdict. Run and vanish, or stay and keep fighting. Bernie's special tool suddenly flared to life, flashing a clear sign that something was out there. Something in the depths answered the hidden item buried under that freshly exposed cliff. Then bam! The light exploded bright as day. Alright, this kept happening, and Bernie couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't just ordinary magic. He knew it had to be powerful magic, and that thought lit a fire in him, so he pushed himself to create something that could flip the whole situation. He swept the area with his eyes and spotted the weapons left behind, scattered like a warning. He leaned in and pushed Al to move, now. Al burst into motion, charging the creature and slamming it toward the cliff, pitting it down with brute force. Bernie snapped his head toward Joseph and demanded, "Can you hold that monster off for 3 minutes?" Joseph snapped with fury and demanded they rush away right now. Bernie grabbed his hands and reminded him, "Don't forget, you still have your skills as a magical tool engineer." He told Joseph, "We're a team. No way you face death alone. We'll all survive, and we'll all come back together." He leaned in and told Joseph to trust him. No doubt, just faith. Bernie's sudden outpouring of real emotion blindsided everyone in the room. Guard Joseph let out a chuckle until Bernie snapped back that this was no joke, and Joseph nodded along immediately. He realized if he couldn't trust his own friend, people would just label him weak. He was praying that once they rolled back into the royal capital, Bernie could forge him a weapon sturdy enough to back him up. When things started going bad, he told Bernie to drop back with Al, then pushed Cliff and Petty to back him up. Joseph and the other guy both nodded hard, like there was no doubt left in the world. Joseph leaned in and offered Bernie a straight-up 3-minute head start. They all raised their swords for him, while Al slammed himself into the fight to keep the monster right where it was. While the room was buzzing, Bernie shouted that he and Al were teaming up to build a magical device and demanded everyone give them exactly 3 minutes. Joseph ordered Cliff and Petty to link up and pounce the moment the enemy's eyes were locked on him. Just a moment later, Bernie called Al back to the room. As Al strode by, he lit a fire under Cliff and told him to trust himself. Cliff just nodded back, like he'd already figured out everything. The 3 explorers sprinted ahead, leaving danger and doubt behind them. Bernie told Al to snatch that powerful magic ore straight out of the rock. Wall. He lunged toward the old weapons lying right beside him. As he watched Bernie tear through the action, Cliff could barely swallow the truth. He had to rely on his tiny younger brother to pull them out of this mess. He messed everything up, and it crushed him because he couldn't keep the people he loved safe. Then he spotted Bernie trembling under the weight of those heavy weapons because one wrong step was about to knock him off his feet. No matter what happened, Bernie's gaze never wavered. Cliff realized right then this wasn't the time to throw in the towel. Dodging the creature's slash at the last second, he recoiled and, just barely, managed to. He remembered why he'd trained it all. Every brutal rep was for the reason that came next. He'd burn for the people ahead of him, his loved ones, and the fearless explorer he always dreamed of becoming. In the brutalest moments, he refused to break, clenched his hope tight, and stood his ground no matter what. Cliff lunged forward and drove a swift hit straight into the monster's eye, dead on. He refused to let go of what he could become. The creature got shoved into the dark, and Joseph snapped out that Cliff had messed up by going solo. Then, despite it all, he still praised him and ordered Petty to hit next. While the others fought that beast head-on, Bernie scrambled to snatch up anything he could get his hands on. Out of nowhere, a magical stone dropped straight into his hands. All showed up, right on time. Bernie stared in disbelief as the powerful magic ore blasted out a blinding, shining light. Then he ripped into the process, mixing it straight with the weapons. The beast tore forward and slashed with razor claws, then screamed so hard the whole place shook. Then it barreled straight at the Cliff. Bernie shouted to him, clearly worried about what might happen next. Cliff remembered Al's words and latched onto them, like faith was the only thing that could carry him forward. To his shock, he halted the monster's attack mid-swing and slammed his sword into its claws, stopping every brutal strike in its tracks. The blast slammed him backwards, sending him into the other 2. Slid in by his side and helped fend off the claws before it could get him. The 3 of them teamed up and hurled the monster back with everything they had. But before they could blink, they got crushed and their weapons shattered at the exact same moment. Then the monster slammed its fist down, wham, and sent everyone crashing to the ground. While they lay broken and frozen in defeat, shattered weapons scattered all around them. The creature flashed a wicked grin and started hunting for Bernie. But he was nowhere to be found, so Cliff still stepped up and told the creature, straight-faced, that it was a real shame it had been beaten. As Bernie blasted high over the beast, he felt the moment closing fast, and he refused to let it slip. Cannon thundering on his shoulder, he locked his sights on the beast below and fired. The creature froze mid-motion, totally stunned and lost. A blazing beam tore through its chest. A brutal tear opened up in its body, and it crashed onto the ground with a thunderous thump. Bernie's breath caught as he wondered, "Is that really it?" Suddenly, something burst out of the creature through its injured flesh. Injured, Cliff snapped at everyone to shut their mouths, because that poison was enchanted and deadly. Bernie frowned in confusion and demanded to know why poison was sitting right there. Thick fog swallowed the ground for a blink, then it blasted away into the distance, gone in seconds. Bernie tried to ask, "Is it done?" But Cliff clamped his arms around him hard. Bernie felt his confusion claw at him until he heard Cliff finally let out a sigh of relief. Relief hit him hard. His little brother was finally safe. Bernie's eyes filled too, and with a shaky voice he said, "All right, it's time to go home." Joseph got hit with a weird, sinking feeling as soon as that strange monster burst onto the scene, and then that magical poison showed up in a place that was supposed to be safe. For now, nothing mattered more than staying alive. In the nearby woods, a hooded man with wild, unique earrings stood there looking gutted by what just happened. The whole event in Rodney Valley finally wrapped up at last. They made the call to lock down the entire valley deep in the woods. Cliff, Bernie, and Al charged home, and you could see worry written all over their faces. Instead of scolding them, Scott and Dorothy pulled them in and wrapped them up in a warm, friendly hug. They're desperately chasing the one thing they want most, going back to their calm, normal routine. Bernie forged a brand new sword for Joseph and Petty. And then he spilled their whole story to the people down at the diner. One day at the diner, he glanced around and the whole place felt eerily quiet, like the noise had vanished. It was lunchtime, but everything stayed eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the wait feel endless. The waitress teased that she'd saved the spot for Bernie again, laughing that he was the only customer in sight. She told me that after the attack on Bernie, everyone in the group just stopped showing up, and it had been ages. Bernie remembered how most of his customers weren't just shoppers, they were straight-up adventurers. Anti-verified it, most folks had packed up from the royal capital, because once Rodney Valley got shut down, those magic ore veins were suddenly no longer safe to mine. Shops that survived on adventures pouring in were getting hit hard and struggling to stay afloat. Bernie and Al's spirits crumpled the moment they heard that. He blurted out an apology for bringing up something so heartbreaking, then asked, "Want to grab some food?" On their way home, I'll wonder if anyone was still peering into that magic poison. The shock had already thundered into the royal capital, and cracking the solution was going to be anything but easy. He racked his brain for ways to change things, and Al kept praying there'd be a reason for adventurers to actually stick around in the city. When they finally made it home, they saw a crowd swelling outside like something big was about to blow up. Scott scanned the crowd and knew this was the perfect moment to slip back in. Bernie leaned in and demanded to know what was going on. The explorers grilled them to make sure it was really Bernie, then begged, "Can you forge weapons for us too?" They told me Joseph at Kaguru filled them in on him, and that his weapons were the absolute finest in the royal capital. Bernie felt a rush of satisfaction the second he heard that. Then it hit him like a lightning bolt. Something crucial finally clicked. If his weapons became the adventurers' go-to, word would spread fast, and suddenly crowds would flood into the capital just to get their hands on them. If that actually happened, it would skyrocket the workshop's growth and health. He jumped in to help his father, and he finally saw his path, designing magical tools as the way he could truly contribute. He begged his dad to let him take over the whole job. He vowed to take full control and build the weapons for everyone. Scott grinned with pride and ruffled his son's hair, then stepped in, asked if Bernie was ready, because things were about to get seriously hectic. The explorers couldn't wait to throw their requests at him, but Bernie snapped at them to settle in and stop squirming. Meanwhile, a hooded stranger slipped through the academy and closed in on Professor Evans. He was a full-blown ecology expert, and for years he'd been digging into deadly magical toxins. The hooded man leaned in and told Evans that the enchanted poison had just sparked a brand new power. Evan, bursting with curiosity, leaned in and couldn't wait to ask what it was. The man flashed a grin, and those signature earrings lit up like crazy. Yep, it was the same dude from before. He snapped his gaze to the window and spotted Lucille on a bench, laughing with a friend, then whipped around and told Evans to help him with his experiment. After that big event, it had been ages since anything had happened in Rodney Valley. But Bernie could feel everything spiraling out of control. The streets and shops looked lifeless, dull, empty, and like the whole town's holding its breath. Bernie finally got it. He could only give it everything, and Al was right there with him, thinking the exact same thing. They burst into Kaguru's base where Joseph greeted them warmly, and Bernie. Bernie handed Zach everything he asked for. Zach thanked him and pitched a quick little activity right before he headed back. Joseph leaned back and pointed out a brutal truth. Bernie's weapons were flying off the shelves in the capital, and adventurers everywhere, way beyond Kaguru's team, were desperate to grab them. Team, Bernie lit up with gratitude for every bit of support, but Joseph clocked something was off and asked why Bernie looked so upset. Bernie explained that the royal capital felt empty and deathly quiet, so he figured he'd better push himself even harder. Stanford, Joseph nodded and said that ever since that whole disaster, fewer adventurers dared to come slipping into the capital. Zach called out Zolan for losing control, claiming he was overreacting and sealing off areas for no reason. Bernie demanded to know if Minister Zolan was the one who ordered their shutdown. Zach nodded and confirmed it. He invited him, then warned that the minister had always hated adventurers trading in magic ore, and figured this was the perfect excuse to squeeze them. No one had the faintest clue when this place would ever feel safe again, especially with that magic poison still running wild. A perfect example. Right now, the forest shut down 5 years ago is still under investigation, and nobody knows what they'll find. And now the guild had hiked the adventurers' fees. So much for fair treatment, because everyone was getting slammed unfairly. Zack watched the treatment drag on, and he feared the royal capital would keep going downhill over and over. I'm about to start freaking out over Kageru's future. Zack leaned in and told him their team was packed with talent, monster-slaying experience, and even handy contacts they'd built through past relationships. Plenty to keep them busy. But beginner groups with younger members still got slammed, since even the simplest requests somehow disappeared into thin air. Bernie finally got it. No fresh adventurers were showing up at all, and even after he hawked enchanted items, some hard limits still stood in his way. As he chatted with adventurers like it was nothing, Joseph suddenly snapped, remembering something crucial he couldn't afford to ignore. He told Bernie to sell the cannon he'd built back then. Earlier, Bernie warned that once they found the key, getting it would be brutal. They'd struck gold with only one scrap of rare magic ore, and because that was all they found, mass-producing the tool was completely off the table. It yanked out almost all its power in one brutal burst, so it barely stood a chance of working, then. Just then. Scott burst in and tore through the room, hunting for Bernie. Bernie, he said he was just passing through. Then he waved me back and asked Bernie to return to the workshop. Zack told Scott to jump back on the site and team up, especially if blacksmithing started to feel brutal. Scott snapped at him to steer clear of those comments, reminding him loud and clear that he wasn't working there anymore. As Zack finished off the words, he wished them both the best, and Scott nodded hard like he was agreeing with every beat of it. Agreement. As they rolled down the road, Scott leaned in and asked his son straight up if anything was weighing on him. Bernie shot back that he wasn't chasing attention at all. He was locked in on one mission, spreading magical tools to way more people, not only adventurers. Scott was convinced his son was the real deal, a good person through and through. He sat there hoping he could make a real difference. Then his eyes snapped to a letter sitting in their mailbox. He cracked it open and realized the letter was stamped from Principal Regal. The principal lit up and praised the staff Lucille used, raving about how top-notch the quality was. He was officially demanding 50 of their sticks for the school, and Bernie couldn't believe they'd go through that many. The principal demanded they grab the magical ore the letter promised would pour out from a magic circle. Then, out of nowhere, a glowing magic circle snapped into existence right nearby, and blasted magical ore onto the ground, raining power everywhere. Bernie yanked his voice up to a scream, calling for his dad. And just like that, Scott finally saw it, one clear goal he had to lock onto. He set out to be the rock his sons could always lean on. He went straight to Bernie, and the two of them sprinted back to the workshop, buzzing with pure excitement. Right then, a bird shot across the sky with a letter tied to its leg. Lucille and her friends sprawled on a bench, laughing and chatting like the beautiful weather was theirs to enjoy. Her friend nodded like she totally got it and said it was perfect for a laid-back garden lunch. Lucille yanked out a sandwich, and her friend's eyes widened when she realized it was the Academy's rare, limited edition special. Then she blurted out that Lucille was crazy lucky to even have one. Lucille said she sprinted to grab it, but deep down, her heart still craved the comfort of home-cooked food. Dishes piled up, and her friend nudged her. Summer break was coming fast, so soon they'd be heading home, while Lucille lit up, saying she couldn't wait. Right then, a bird ripped out of the sky and dove straight toward them. They noticed a letter strapped to its leg. When it landed on Lucille's hand, everything clicked. She knew it was her dad's message. Bad. She studied it for a beat, then smiled like she'd just found gold. Her friend. Her friend just knew it had to be good news, something bright hiding in the middle of all this. Lucille swore it was true and spilled that the principal had asked her dad for something, so her dad and her little brother were heading to the academy to grab it, and she even hoped everyone could meet up. Her friend then remembered that Lucille's dad was a blacksmith. Lucille Smith agreed, then told me how, just the other day while she was training magic with her dad's crafted staff, the principal marched over and said that. She realized the magic felt so effortless because the tools were top-notch, then froze when the principal asked her dad for a favor. Lucille gives the bird one last kind wish, and you can feel the moment hang in the air. And it leapt into the sky with pure, joyful energy. Her friend lit up and said she couldn't wait. Lucille was finally coming to visit her family after ages. And Lucille fired back that she was just as thrilled about it. As they sprinted to their next class, they shot past. They marched past a horde of gigantic bull-like monsters, all snorting and pacing behind iron fences. Lucille's friends stared in disbelief because the academy was literally keeping monsters on campus. Lucille remembered they were there to study the environment, and she said the magic kept the creatures from going wild, but still, standing that close to them felt downright tense. They looked on as a girl student slid medicine to the monsters like it was their lifeline. She poured it into the pan and handled the creature with steady, unshakable calm. Lucille's friends said the students fighting those monsters were all in Professor Evans' class, and honestly, if I were in their shoes, I'd freeze so hard with fear that I'd bolt. As they were strolling along, one of the monsters suddenly snapped and went totally feral. Lucille tried to scream for a teacher, but the moment wouldn't let her. But the girl from before snapped a soothing spell into place, and with gentle breaths, she quieted the beast's fury. Lucille and her friends stared in disbelief, mouths open, completely blown away. The girl stopped the monster cold, and then cast soothing magic without even speaking a word. But Lucille couldn't shake the doubt. Was this really normal magic, since she felt absolutely no magical energy in the air? It looked like the girl was talking straight to the monster's face. She kept soothing it until the chaos finally calmed and it settled into stillness. Lucille's jaw dropped. She couldn't shake the feeling that this girl had some serious, special talent. She closed the distance and asked straight up what kind of skills she had. Lucille grinned and said she was a student in the Magic Studies program, then asked the girl's name. The girl shot back, "I'm Gina." He bolted off in a flash, then blurted, "Sorry," before disappearing. Lucille's friend couldn't stop asking why Gina had to bolt out of there so fast. Meanwhile, Scott, Bernie, and Al rushed out to grab whatever supplies they could find. Bernie lunged in to help cut the wood. He wanted to, but he was just too small to pull it off the right way. He could see just how hard his dad was grinding. As the days dragged on, Bernie refused to sleep. He stayed up all night, throwing himself into helping anyone he could. Dorothy kept coming back, dropping off fresh meals every time like a lifeline. They finally slammed the lid on that massive order. Scott thanked Bernie for burning the midnight oil and jumping in to help. They had to haul those staves straight to the academy, but getting them there was going to be a nightmare. Bernie dropped a rock-solid idea on how to crush the problem. He stumbled onto a recipe that demanded a giant leather bag, metal supplies, and chunks of magic ore. Scott sprinted to grab the bag and the metal, saying they still had a few magic orbits left from making the stabs. With everything lined up perfectly, Bernie locked in and poured his focus into his craft. Out of nowhere, a brand new suitcase appeared and Scott went, "Seriously? It looks like just a normal bag." Bernie let out a chuckle and said, "Yeah, I guess it might look that way." He yanked open the suitcase, snatched a staff, and shoved it into a secret compartment. Then it disappeared like it was never there. Finished. Scott's eyes widened when Bernie said this. This bag isn't just roomy. It swallows tons of gear and still handles even the biggest stuff like it's nothing. Scott's heart surged with excitement as he lifted his son high above his head. Bernie begged them not to look at him like some kid, and Scott just snorted, grinning that yeah, he was still pretty young. He grinned because his little magical gadget maker was right there with him. Once he slammed the last box into place, he finally got to catch his breath. Time for a well-earned break. The next day at the academy, the caged monsters unleashed a thick, crawling fog. Fog swirled around them, and their eyes burned red with fury. Right after that, Scott, Bernie, and Al rolled into the academy with zero problems. Scott watched the person head to the gate, ready to snatch up the items. He whipped his head around and spotted the guards watching nearby. One of them was Will, Scott's buddy, and when Will saw him, his whole face lit up. Scott brought Will into the room and told Bernie, "We used to work together at Kaguru." Agru looked on as Will lit up with joy when he saw Bernie. Then he stepped forward, introduced himself, and bam! Al, his special creature too. Al told the guard, "Check me if you want," and Will was left wide-eyed because it was his first time running into anything magical, and the fact it could talk just shattered him. Weak. As Will gently stroked Al, he grilled him about their visit, still even after he'd already spotted their names on the guest list. Scott explained it was the principal's order, then begged to be let inside. Will still choke on the truth that the once daring adventurer now grinds into a respectable blacksmith. Curious as hell, Bernie pressed his question, what kind of wild adventure did his father chase? Will remembered it. Scott was a real adventurer, the kind nearly everyone in the royal capital knew by name. Well, Will felt his own skills were boxed in, so he decided to leave. Scott, though, chose to resign to keep steady money coming for his family, and Will couldn't help but respect that choice. Bernie had no clue his father had already done it, quietly carrying the whole weight for their family. Still, Will could tell Scott looked way healthier and way more confident than he ever had before. Scott told Bernie he'd haul the staves straight to the principal, then urged Bernie to catch Lucille first, and he quickly asked Will if that plan was cool. Turns out the guard confirmed it was. Then we watched them march straight into the academy. Suddenly, the hooded figure slipped in behind him without a sound. Inside the academy, Bernie stared in disbelief at just how massive and roomy the place felt. Alan asked if Bernie had finally received Lucille's message about where they were supposed to meet. Bernie stared at the new note, then grinned and said they'd be eating lunch in the garden, and the message even came with a map to guide them there. Out of nowhere, they spotted people staring right at them. Bernie had already spilled the whole story to their friends in the royal capital, so for folks who didn't chase thrills, Al probably looked like nothing but another monster, and honestly, he understood why. No matter what, Al still felt like family, and it just didn't sit right watching him get judged like that. Suddenly, Al shot Bernie a quick lick across the cheek. Right on his cheek, calming him down and telling him not to worry about it. In the garden, Gina couldn't bury the guilt of leaving the girls behind, and all she could think was how this might be her shot to finally connect with new friends. She remembered the moment they caught her hanging out with the creatures, and still tried to reach out to her anyway. She sat there, staring ahead when, right past her, Bernie and Al slipped by, locked in a serious, non-stop conversation. She froze, stunned by what she saw. Then both of them dropped down right beside her because that was the biggest space they could find. Gina's chest tightened when the thought hit her. Maybe someone else out there was just like her. She snapped at Bernie and demanded to know, could he really talk to animals? Bernie told them it wasn't magic at all, just a special device that translated everything. Later, the moment Gina heard it, her excitement instantly collapsed. When she asked, Bernie was convinced she could truly talk to animals. Animals, Gina nodded fast, calling it an unusual gift, and admitted people always labeled her a strange kid because she only talked with animals. Bernie couldn't help but wonder why they felt that way, because her talent honestly looked unreal. Wow, Gina couldn't stop herself from thanking him, because his words hit her right in the heart. She told me she grew up out in the middle of nowhere, no kids her age anywhere, so she bonded with the village animals instead. She tried to break through at the academy, but the moment someone came up to her the other day, panic hit hard and she bolted. She was convinced she'd blown her only chance. Look, Bernie pointed out that she strode up to him and Al with real confidence, and he could tell. She was genuinely kind. His mind. When he spoke, Gina blinked, because the way he said it totally threw her off as she stared at his face like it held answers. Just like that, he started looking way too familiar. So familiar, it sent her mind racing. Then, from out of nowhere, someone screamed, "Bernie!" It was Lucille. Gina snapped to it immediately, remembering she was the same girl from that exact moment. That moment hit Bernie like a lightning bolt. Gina wasn't talking about him at all. She meant his older sister. Lucille told Al just how much she'd missed them, then wrapped him in a tight, trembling hug. Gina couldn't wait to learn whether Bernie had messed up in the Rodney Valley, so she tried to slip away under the radar. But he accidentally crushed a twig under his foot. That sharp noise snapped Lucille's head up, and she demanded if Gina was with her brother. Gina shot back that it was just a freak coincidence. Bernie pulled her into the plan, inviting her to join them for lunch and urging her to come along. Lucille nodded hard, and Bernie flan. Bernie shot Gina a quick, cryptic hand sign. She finally blurted out, "Yes!" Everyone sprawled out in the garden, and Bernie declared, "All right, lunchbox time." But Lucille just stared, because he wasn't holding a thing. Then Bernie totally blindsided him, yanking out a whole basket of food from that tiny bag like it was magic. Lucille realized it was an enchanting gadget, and her smile said it all. This little magical tool creator never let them down. She was stunned to discover an entire spread of fresh, mouth-watering sandwiches. Bernie carried their mom's message straight to Lucille. Go join the others for dinner, and don't forget to take care of yourself. Lucille was so moved that it lit a spark in them, and suddenly they felt ready to start eating. After they were done eating, Lucille and Gina leaned in and talked because Professor Evans had specifically singled out Gina to deal with the monsters. Monsters. Gina leaned in and said the professor basically told her that her gift for talking to them wasn't exactly doing her any favors at the academy. Bernie saw this coming because the place was crawling with monsters. Monsters. Al's nerves shot through the roof as he asked if they ever turned aggressive. Janice told everyone the monsters were trapped in check by special magic, and that they'd just been given medicine to calm their rage and keep them thriving. Lucille practically couldn't believe it. This academy didn't just babysit the monsters, it actually pushed research right there in the garden, and she even spotted Bernie already hunting down those medicinal herbs they were growing for study. Meanwhile, the principal stared at the staves, totally awestruck, and praised them as outstanding. She clocked the 50 of them, then hoped Scott would help the academy again down the road, while Scott felt nothing but pride for being able to support her. Her principal stepped up and praised Lucille for her standout accomplishments. Scott couldn't stand it. He needed to know what she meant by that. She told me Lucille's grades were insane, and she just won an award for snapping the winning streak in a practice battle. Lucille didn't just want to be a top mage, she craved more, and the principal could tell it was her steady grind that fueled it. Scott couldn't hide his joy when he heard his daughter was really putting in the effort. The principal leaned in, told him to breathe, and promised they'd take care of Lucille. Scott trusted her completely and backed away, letting her take the lead. The moment he cracked the door open, a hooded figure was already standing there, looming right in front of him. The man clocked the delay and blurted out, "I'm running late!" But he still insisted it was fine. He slammed his fist on the door, and right before his eyes, a glowing circle started to bloom. Scott leaned in and demanded to know who the hooded figure really was. He sprawls outside, lifeless, drowning in his own blood. Blood. The hooded man said he didn't want to drag the principal or Scott into it. He called Scott by his full name and even tossed Bernie's name into the mix. The man said his name, then Scott's whole body went cold, and he snapped, demanding to know how the hell he knew both his name and his son's. The hooded man snapped that Bernie had messed with him lately. So he showed up in person, rolled up his sleeves, and cast a spell. And then, those creatures trapped inside the academy started to grow, swelling out like the walls couldn't hold them anymore. The band cranked up, and the students nearby screamed in pure terror. Bernie and the others heard the cries cutting through the air. A huge horde of students was sprinting away like the building was on fire. They rallied more people to jump in, and Bernie couldn't help but wonder what on earth was happening. Lucille saw the students bolt out of the Monster Care Center, and her stomach dropped because she knew something terrible had already happened. Gina's jaw dropped at what she was seeing. The creatures she cared for had swelled into something massive and completely out of control. Tamed, then she demanded answers, wondering why they were acting like this. Bernie realized the monsters weren't just attacking, they were slipping magical poison into the air. Lucille raised her staff and pushed them to move fast, now! Gina snapped to a stop, grabbed the moment, and told her she'd handle the monsters by herself. She worked to calm them down, and their eyes. Their eyes flashed back to normal for a split second, then snapped away again, fast. But the sky of violence dimmed in an instant, then they tore back into their savage rampage. Gina got slammed by their rampage as they came charging in, then Lucille ripped in and saved her. And she tore the seal open, blasting her ice-free spell into the world. Jagged shards of ice cranked around the creatures like a deadly cage. Lucille swore she'd freeze every single one of them solid. Gina pushed her to quit insisting the monsters weren't naughty kids, and it hit hard. She felt sick with guilt for not watching over them properly. Tears poured down her face as she begged Lucille not to hurt them. Lucille hesitated then, right before she could react, another creature shot forward and lunged at a student nearby. Al burst in at the last second and shoved the creature out of the way. He snatched the creature's horn and hurled it aside then. Then he shoved the student into motion and barked, "Run! Get away!" Bernie jumped in to help the evac, scanning for a way to calm the creatures instead of battling them, hunting for a fix to the enchanted toxin. A creature lunged in and tried to smash Lucille and Gina to pieces. Lucille snapped on her upgraded shield in a blink. She prayed to buy the monsters just a little more time, long enough to cast healing magic on them. Bernie heard her out, and the idea lit a spark: freeze those monsters right where they stood. He spotted a fresh stash of herbs right nearby. He blared to his sister that he'd built a device to freeze the monsters in their tracks, so she just had to hang on a little longer. He told me how he cracked the secret to teamwork in Rodney Valley, and it changed everything. Valley practically couldn't wait. He was hungry for them to team up and bring their powers together. Lucille picked up his confidence and knew, without a doubt, she could count on him. Bernie swore he'd keep those monsters under control, then clapped onto Al and rode off to get ready. Scott got shoved into the principal's office, and there, lurking in a hooded shadow, was a strange figure staring him down. Bernie demanded that Al point him straight to the anesthetic grass. As they pushed forward, Al spotted injured students sobbing their hearts out, begging for help. "Help! There's still a little time left!" They sprinted forward and burst into a tiny garden. In the garden, Al caught that sweet whiff of fresh-cut grass, and it hit him like the world just got brand new. Bernie whipped his head around and spotted the plants in a flash. Then he yanked out the charm like it was about to change everything. Al promised he'd come back to rescue the students who were still there, and then he asked if Bernie could handle things on his own. Bernie swore he'd finish up fast and catch up with him in no time. As Al stormed off, Bernie quickly pulled up his status. He opened the status window and stared at the bench right beside him. A student crumpled to the ground, pinned there by the pain of her injuries. A monstrous creature launched itself at her in a terrifying lunge. Al burst in just on time, yanked her out of danger, and coached her through the panic until she could finally breathe. Then he lunged at another beast and slammed it down hard. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The monster they once feared turned out to be their ally. Al fought like a one-man storm, but the enemy crushed him and drove its horn straight through him. Panic rippled through the students as they wondered if they should keep sprinting while Al was in real trouble. Al was moments from being overwhelmed, but a few brave students spun around and threw up protective spells to shield him. The boys chimed in, "We've got an idea too." The girls leapt in right beside him, insisting they could team up and shield the academy, and Al couldn't believe how fierce their resolve was. "Solve!" Right then, Bernie burst back into the room and shouted that he'd finished. Scott squared up to the hooded figure, staring them down. He heard the screams outside, and rage exploded through him. He demanded to know what the hooded man had done, but the man insisted it was just a test, and swore that neither Scott nor the principal could get involved. He made sure Scott couldn't interfere at all. Then a gust of wind slammed around Scott and sealed him in. Scott clung to him and swore he'd tear him apart, while the man sneered, thinking Scott was just some brawler who'd get crushed by a mage like him. He figured the once great explorer would fold and follow his lead. Scott vanished out of nowhere. A blade suddenly popped into view behind him, knife first and aimed at his throat, and he warned that even that little dagger could be used to fend off danger, but one slip and it could kill. He slammed the question onto the man again, what he did to those students and what he was really trying to pull off. Steve, the hooded man, froze in shock when Scott slipped his magic with nothing but brute strength. He burst into applause and swore up and down it was nothing but a test. Saying the rest didn't matter at all. Scott didn't need it to understand. The hooded figure snapped the powerful spell, and Scott got launched into the air like a cannonball. Scott knew the spell should have hit the caster hard, but the hooded man looked totally unhurt. As soon as he clocked Scott's speed, the hooded man lunged, faster than before. Scott dodged every magical strike and seized the perfect opening. Then he slashed straight for the man's neck. But the man in the hood scoffed, snapping his blade to a halt and declaring it was useless, and slammed a sphere of dark energy straight into Scott's stomach. Scott slammed into the far side of the hallway, and the whole place felt the impact. The cloaked stranger leaned in and told Scott, "Someone like you, once an adventurer too, has no chance, so just quit." Scott stared into the silence and thought about his family. Then his mind raced to what came next. He ignored. He admitted the scars of his old adventurer days, but now he forged weapons for a living and vowed to protect everyone he loved with his whole heart. With a sharp flick of his hand, a whole swarm of swords materialized in front of him. Then the hooded man watched his knife shatter into scrap as the blade screamed straight at his face. He slipped past them and turned to Scott, praising his clever move like it was pure genius. Scott spotted another opening and lunged into attack, while the hooded man slipped to the side. But his hood slid just enough. Scott's eyes caught a familiar mark on his back. Back at the academy grounds, meanwhile, everything was heating up. The students fought to keep their wild monsters from going totally out of control. Out of nowhere, a voice ripped through the air and screamed for them to duck, right now. Bernie clung to Al's back, gripping a crossbow like it was his last shot. And he loosed arrows, each one soaked in a one-of-a-kind concoction. Every shot screamed toward the creatures, like guided arrows hunting their targets, crushing them one after another. Bernie flat out said it worked like a charm. He forged a mind-bending device from numbing grass, mystical ore, sturdy benchwood, and iron, and the punch it packed was downright terrifying. Then he snapped his focus to fresh targets. Lucille admitted she'd finally drained her magic, yet she still held the protective spell steady. Bernie leaned in and demanded that she and Gina duck low. Lucille couldn't help it. When she saw his head, she burst into relief because he was finally back. Bernie locked onto the creature and fired off more paralysis arrows. A storm of arrows slammed into the giant beast, and it finally crumpled to the ground. And somehow it still stayed conscious. Bernie froze, stunned. The creature ripped the air with a thunderous roar, and the girls got knocked flat onto the ground. Bernie demanded answers as the sedative refused to work. Then someone interrupted, asking what the heck was happening. So you'll finally see how the creatures got hit by that magical poison outbreak, and why it all started in the first place. Outbreak. Then it hit. Professor Evans. Gina's jaw dropped, and she couldn't stop wondering what he was doing here. I couldn't stop thinking, why were the monsters acting up like this when she always handed them their medicine? Evans just couldn't believe what he was seeing. It felt too wild to be real. He said the special potion they were giving the animals was supposed to calm them down and keep illnesses from taking hold, because someone had told him it would work. Bernie's curiosity flared. Who on earth was that person? When Gina heard that, everything clicked. She finally realized the truth. She caused the mess because she'd already handed over the medicine, so they were covered. She crumpled to the floor, guilt crashing down on her like a wave. Lucille stared at her tears for a moment, then shot back to her feet. Feet? She leaned in and told Gina, "Come on, take a look around." Gina glanced up and her heart dropped as she spotted the injured students scattered across the whole schoolyard. Lucille straight up said that everyone was grinding as hard as they could with whatever they had. Gina almost threw in the towel way too early. Soon she pushed her to be bold if she wanted to save those monsters. Then she told Bernie, "Do it again, right now," while she lined up her healing magic, ready to strike at the exact perfect moment. Gina felt this fierce bond with the monsters, and Lucille stood right beside her, and little by little she forced herself up because she wouldn't let the people around her down. Lucille exhaled in pure relief. Gina had sworn she'd help them no matter what came. Gina snatched Lucille's wand and blasted her power straight through it. It pushed onward, safe inside the protective barrier. She declared she'd try once more to reach those monsters, and Lucille just nodded right along, and told Bernie to get the anesthetic ready the second she gave the go-ahead. Gina locked in and poured her energy into the air, asking the creature if it could hear her. She pushed her voice hard and begged it to breathe slow again, just like it used to. She reached out, promised it she'd end its suffering, and begged it to trust her. Her eyes flickered, and then their darkness slammed back into place. And it started thrashing like a beast gone mad. Gina was just about. Gina finally got it. The enchanted poison was choking her voice and locking her out of the ability to shout to the monsters, and she could only hope they'd find a way to dull its deadly grip. Lucille felt the monsters simmer down, but the danger was still razor sharp. Her healing magic hit its absolute peak when she stayed close, because the nearer she was, the stronger the power surged. So all she could do was hold that barrier steady while she healed, pushing through a combined spell she'd never even tried before. She felt totally shaken, unsure she could pull it off, because even if she did win, her healing power still wouldn't hit as strong. Still, it was the only move she could think of. Gina leaned in and told her, "I believe in you, just like Lucille did." And Lucille just nodded right back, realizing she had to trust both of them and trust herself too. She replayed everything that came before in her mind and braced herself, ready to shield them from what was coming next. She unleashed an even stronger defense spell, then snapped at Bernie to move. Bernie snapped into motion and unleashed a storm of arrows, landing hit after hit on the beast. As Lucille chanted her spell, she shoved him forward and shouted that she'd take it from here. She hurled a healing spell at the arrows buried in the monster's skin. As the spell hit, a thick wave of black fog blasted out of the monster's mouth like it had been unleashed. Bernie's eyes widened the moment he clocked what his sister had just pulled off. Done. Gina snatched the moment and struck up a conversation with the beast. She swallowed the pain and said, "I'm sorry," because she finally understood they never wanted to hurt like this. Still, she finally admitted the truth. She'd never had friends at all. But once she started caring for the monsters, the academy didn't feel so empty anymore. Lonely, she didn't just move on. After it was all over, she begged to take care of them again, because they meant everything to her. Lucille swore she wouldn't leave her, vowing to stay glued by her side, Gina Grinda. Then it was game time. Side by side, they announced their mission: rescue the monsters. They teamed up and helped the creature claw its way back to calm, finally finding peace. The creature finally tore free from He struck the enchanted poison, and then he crumpled to the ground. Gina bolted up and wrapped her arms around it, and pure relief hit hard. Tears spilled down her face. Lucille crumpled to the ground, finally breathing easy now that it was over and the weight was gone. Bernie leaned in, nudged her arm, and blurted out, "High five." "High five," Lucille grined and obliged. Scott spotted the symbol stamped on the back of the hooded man's cloak. The man clenched his fists, then snapped into action with shockingly fast speed. Scott moved like a seasoned fighter, slipping the quick punch at the last second. He threw a punch and tried to slash back with his knife. Knife clashes filled the air, and they traded blows hard, until the hooded man finally backed off. He couldn't hold it in. Scott's non-stop trouble had him fuming. He yanked his hood back, revealing a bare head, and admitted he never planned to take this fight even slightly serious. With a snap of his fingers, a brutal, power-packed spell erupted right beneath him. Dense black fog burst out of the circle like something was ripping open reality, molding itself into something that looked like a four-winged bird. Scott figured the fight would be pointless unless both teams locked in and treated it like the real deal. Seriously, this bald man squared up and moved in, ready to end him. Out of nowhere, the wall behind him exploded into rubble. The stranger hauled out tougher ropes and lashed both the creature and the bald man tight. The bald man leaned in and said this was exactly why he wanted to lock the principal away. "Find!" Principal Regal burst through the shattered wall, pieces of debris still raining down behind him. Her face hardened, and she demanded he take responsibility for the chaos he'd unleashed at her school. The bald man slammed his hand down and declared, "My time is up." Scott felt fury surge through him and shot back, asking if he was just trying to run away. The man insisted he'd gotten enough results and demanded they regroup later. Scott lunged forward, trying to cut his own head clean off. Right before the man disappeared like smoke, he whispered a quiet goodbye to Scott. In the blink of an eye, the culprit vanished, just like that. At that exact moment, Evans dropped his head and blurted, "I'm sorry." Then he took every ounce of blame. Jenna couldn't shake the thought that the medicine triggered the whole incident, and Evans nodded. Yeah, it was probably the culprit. Yeah, he figured those repeat doses lit the fuse and triggered the outburst, but he knew other things might have played a part too. Gina finally got it. Those pills weren't trying to cure illness at all. Lucille leaned in, her curiosity blazing, and demanded to know how they ended up with it. Evans said one day a stranger hunted them down, pitching a sedative that could fight disease, brewed from magical poison, and demanding they run clinical trials on the creatures kept at their school. All right, Evans, running the whole monster management show, couldn't ignore a single weird detail, and then that guy slid over an official document that flat out proved the drug actually worked. Evans snapped back to the truth. He still had the evidence. He yanked it open and tore free the papers stamped and signed by the king. Right in front of their eyes, the document suddenly erupted into flames. Everyone jolted back in shock as it happened. Lucille could feel magic lurking in the shadows, like it was meant to erase every last shred of proof. Bernie demanded to know who that man even was. Evan said the guy never once gave a name or any group he belonged to, yet regular folks couldn't get national approval papers that easy, so Evans was convinced he had government ties. With the documents gone, their proof vanished too. Out of nowhere, someone burst in and dropped an insane, game-changing idea. Scott tore forward with purpose, and one sharp principal marched right beside. Lucille's stomach dropped the moment she saw Scott was injured. Scott told us a mysterious man smashed into the principal's office, and he looked like the same person who'd slipped him the medicine. Right in the middle of the fight, he caught the symbol painted on the guy's back. He swore it came straight from the kingdom's magical forces, but the others couldn't stomach it. The principal said the school was wrecked, and even though Evans meant no harm, he couldn't just let him wander off alone. He had to march in and talk to everyone involved. Evans swallowed the whole mess, took full blame, and promised he'd set the record straight, because the president had already made the call. As the others rushed off for treatment, Scott leaned over and barked, "Bernie!" He told him the stranger knew all about the Rodney O'Valley incident, and even called Bernie by name, then pressed him, asking if Bernie had noticed anyone weird back then. Time froze, and Bernie, stunned, snapped back that he had no clue. Scott let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, relief crashing over him because Bernie was finally okay. Meanwhile, Bernie sank into deep, intense reflection. The creatures in Rodney Valley probably didn't just pop up by themselves, more like something far bigger kicked them into existence, even this time. Then, for reasons he couldn't even wrap his head around, certain people went out of their way to ruin families and friends, pure, deliberate cruelty. That guy knew Bernie well. He was ready to come back for him. Bernie realized it was time to get way stronger. Longer, his eyes hardened with resolve as he made a promise. He vowed to protect everyone who mattered to him, no matter what. Before long, everyone rushed to the principal, trading their stories one after another. She soaked it all in, smiled, and let her gratitude spill out. She quickly made it clear the attacker and the one handing out the drug were the exact same person. With everyone staring at that talent, it was pretty much guaranteed he was part of the kingdom's magic team, or some other squad just as deadly. Scott suddenly realized this wasn't going to stay simple. It was about to get way more complicated than they'd thought. The headmaster declared the school would launch its own investigation, then slammed the door on the meeting and ended it. Scott swallowed his pride, apologized, and bolted out the door with his kids right on his heels. Before they left, the principal pulled Bernie aside and called for him. Scott leaned in and told his son, "Stay put, we're waiting out here." Bernie lingered on that side and slid into a seat beside the principal. She apologized for cutting him off so suddenly, and Bernie waved it off, saying it was totally fine, then asked if something was wrong. The principal finally realized his weapon could calm those rampaging monsters. Bernie told me his power wasn't something he cooked up alone. He even admitted he'd built a special tool by using pieces he borrowed from the academy. The principal demanded to see it, and Bernie wasted no time. He whipped out the crossbow right in front of her. She grinned at it like it was about to betray her secrets, and the grin turned into a rush of rum. He shot off a comment that it was an awesome creation, and she instantly figured he'd inherited that gift from his parents. Then Bernie just soaked up the compliment and smiled. She said magical tool engineer jobs were about as rare as a miracle in their country. Up to now, only legendary wizards could forge magical tools. It took them years to finally crack the secret, because only a tiny crew ever reached that level, and there was still a whole mountain of mysteries left to uncover about those enchanted items. Bernie didn't even realize it at first, but once he clocked it, he knew he was doing something huge, and the power that comes from having a real job in this world was downright unreal. The principal straight up told everyone that the academy had drilled students hard on magic and combat rules. So that's why nobody dared to chase crafting jobs, because even then the academy still needed its spark to keep thriving. She couldn't stop wondering what it took to build a magical tool as a real engineer. Engineer Bernie leaned in and demanded to know what she meant by that, and moments later he stormed out of the principal's office, stunned to his core. The principal couldn't stop praising him, and every word sounded like a victory. Bernie realized there was no way he could carry everything alone, so he pushed himself harder, no excuses. As he stepped out, he caught the wrecked courtyard from the event, and the damage hit him like a punch. Scott was knee-deep in the cleanup when he caught sight of him. Bernie called the meeting to a close and then spotted the courtyard wrecked. Scott nodded right along, like, yeah, that checks out. Yeah, the Chaos wouldn't stand a chance. Between his blacksmith skills and Bernie's talent for repairs, they could fix most of it fast. He leaned in and asked his son to team up, and Bernie lit up and said, yes! The students all jumped in at once to help clean up the place. Lucille spotted someone closing in, and it was a dam. It was one of her father's old friends. He'd survived, but his body was scarred from the wounds he fought through. Lucille slammed her healing magic onto him, pushing him back from the brink so he could start recovering. Bernie and Al kept jumping in to help their neighbors, over and over again. When a stranger burst from the side, they waved Bernie over like it was urgent. They shoved him into a shed packed wall to wall with monsters, and demanded his help to fix it, and Bernie sprinted over fast too. Had to jump into fixing it, then a couple students came running up to me. They rushed up to Al and blurted out their thanks for bailing them out earlier. Al said, no need to thank anyone, we're all here to back each other up. But the girl from earlier snapped back, insisting it was something bigger, something far greater. A kid in the class blurted out that he'd picked up something huge just from watching Al's dedication burn so bright. He made it clear, who you are to someone isn't judged by your face, it's decided by what you feel inside and how you act toward them. Look, those students swore they'd get stronger, no questions asked, so they could help others without a second thought. Bernie, just like Al, lit up the moment he heard it. Al flashed a proud, glowing smile at them. He pushed them to slam the queening out fast and even let them pet his soft tail for free. Right then, Lucille stormed over to Gina, who kept sweeping alone in the corner. Gina asked if she'd finished caring for the guard, and Lucille nodded, then told her she'd come back to help with the cleanup. Cleanup duty done, she still wanted answers about what would happen to the monsters Gina had taken care of, and Gina told her the principal said they could hang on to them for now. But their restraints had to be tightened first, and the teachers would step in to handle them for a little while. Lucille couldn't wait to team up with him and care for the creatures together. She wanted to befriend them and shower them with love. Love. Gina strutted in like she owned the place, absolutely sure they could pull it off. Right after that, a group of girls walked by and spotted Lucille, and they immediately surged over, relieved she was still standing. She hadn't gotten hurt. They admitted they were terrified to jump in, so they kept watching from a distance, then gushed that her bravery was absolutely incredible. Lucille admitted she didn't do much, then insisted everyone chipped in, and the girls snapped back, begging her to stop brushing off how much she really did. Gina held her breath and stayed quiet until the girls finally turned and faced her. People said she was straight up awesome, and nobody ever expected her to pull off abilities like that. They introduced themselves, then straight up blurted out, "Let's be friends." Gina froze for a second, then snapped forward and greeted them with a handshake. She shook, then told him her name, confessing how truly happy she was to. She was about to meet them, and Lucille's heart practically burst with joy. Time kept slipping away, until at long last she reached the academy gates. Gate watched Lucille tear herself away and tell her family goodbye. She yanked Bernie into yet another fierce hug. Even the principal and Scott's friend hurried over to say their goodbyes. Bernie waved hard as their carriage rolled off, shrinking into the distance. On the ride back, Scott caught the news from Bernie. Turns out the principal himself wants him at the academy. At the academy, Bernie said the principal was nothing but kind to him. Then today's events hit, proving he's still got a long way to level up. He was sure those magical tools had insane power, but they refused to fully work because his own skills just weren't strong enough yet. Then, when Scott heard that, he immediately knew he couldn't wait. He had to step up and get better. He'd just let the enemy slip out of sight at the worst possible moment, right in front of him, and that's when it hit. He wasn't nearly as fast or nimble as he used to be back in his adventurer days. He swore to himself that the moment he ran into that man again, he'd finally set everything straight. He finally snapped into focus and knew he had to act. Then he said, he told Bernie about a spot called Stone Village, deep in the Dragon region. He told me he found real support there when he first kicked off his journey as an adventurer. Right beside them sat a mine brimming with magical ore. He said he was thinking about heading there soon for training, then leaned in and asked Bernie if he wanted to tag along. Bernie's face lit up as he eagerly nodded and swore he'd dig deep no matter what it took. Deep down, Scott realized he had to stay true to his roots if he wanted to protect his family for real. That night, the principal leaned in and spilled everything that happened at the academy to someone. She blurted out her fears that someone might be forging the documents and that it could tie straight back to the kingdom's magic core, so she hauled it to a trusted royal family member right away. Family member. This guy was Matthias, and then the story rushed in. The principal demanded to know what he knew, and Matthias swore he had no clue, while his curiosity screamed for answers about that enchanted device the engineer wouldn't stop talking about. Suddenly, someone barged into the room without a single knock. Knock! Matthias shot out the name like he was checking a lock, insisting he'd already sent everyone away, then turned to Minister Zolan and demanded why he'd come. Zolan admitted he couldn't ignore the worrying scraps of their conversation, so he stepped in too. Matthias lit up, said it helped, and then pushed, "Do you know what's been going on at the academy lately?" The minister swore up and down that he knew nothing at all, but he couldn't ignore the shock about the magic core and the terrifying rumor of fake documents, so he declared he'd kick off a deep, no-holds-barred investigation. An investigation kicked off under Crown Prince Baker, the very first prince, and Matthias got hit with a sudden jolt of surprise. The minister leaned in and asked if that was really all right. Matthias cracked a grin, sprang up to his feet and nodded, said it was all good and that he really appreciated the help. He strolled past the minister and dropped the bomb. He vanished for a while, then ordered the minister to track down his brother and tell him what was going on. He said there was one person he had to see, no excuses, no matter what. Barely had the father and son stepped into the mining site with Al when everything started moving. Scott told me Stone Village used to be peaceful and small, until that nearby mine kicked in, and suddenly crowds poured in, turning it into non-stop chaos. Bernie thought the academy mess was finally over, convinced his dad was taking him to hunt for magic. Or maybe he was just buzzing too hard about the adventure to think straight. They rushed to Dorothy, begging for her permission. She figured Scott was headed to meet someone she knew in Stone Village, but Scott only shrugged and said he'd be gone for a while. After a while, Bernie clocked it. His dad wasn't aiming for the same thing at all, and now he couldn't stop wondering what the real plan was. As they pushed into the woods, Al blurted, "Scott!" And Scott suddenly remembered. These forest paths near the village felt tied to the very woods where they first crossed paths. So he asked if it was safe. He warned that the forest near the village was off limits, but said it should be okay if they kept their distance, then made it clear they still had to stay on guard. They kept their eyes peeled, because their prize was literally just around the corner. The whole crew finally burst into Stone Village. Scott suggested they head straight to the village chief before anything else. They stroll down the streets, like the whole city's holding its breath for what's next. Bernie couldn't shake the unease the moment he laid eyes on the rundown, falling apart surroundings. He told his dad that the place felt forgotten and almost empty, and Al admitted the whole vibe was dead and lifeless. Soon after, they spotted a huge crowd packed tight together, shoulder to shoulder. Bernie yelled at them, and the men answered with murderous, angry stares. They were desperate to figure out who they even were and why they'd ended up there, only to realize the crowd looked like it had come just to laugh at them. Bernie froze in place, while Scott closed the distance and made it crystal clear they weren't looking to cause any trouble. He said they'd come to meet Chief Zhu and asked anyone they could for directions. The elderly man nearby snapped to attention, eyes wide, and shot up from his seat. He pushed through the crowd and demanded to know if the voice belonged to Scott. Scott lit up the moment he saw him, and then admitted it had been way too long. The old man blinked in disbelief, saying he could barely fathom how much stronger Scott had become. The two men stormed off, clearly fed up, and the old man pulled Scott inside, sighing with regret over how cold the villagers were. As soon as they were inside, Zeus leaned in and grilled Scott about how he'd been. Scott admitted he'd quit adventuring for good, was running a blacksmith shop in the royal capital now, and honestly, he finally felt like he'd found his real place. He pressed on, then asked about the little boy and the big dog. Scott introduced the boy as his son Bernie and the dog as Al, their beloved companion. Then Bernie said hello to the elderly man, and Zealous couldn't believe it when Scott finally revealed he had a kid. Scott pointed out that Bernie was the second son, then added he had an older son and a daughter, and the old man lit up at the news. Scott told Bernie the old man wasn't just some stranger, he was the village leader of Stone Village. The village where his old mentor Zeus still loomed in every shadow. He praised Zeus as a legendary adventurer and a deadly fighter, especially when it came to offensive magic. Then Zalus snapped, "Stop! because Zeus was just an old man now. Man, Bernie finally ran into his father's mentor, and that's when everything clicked, revealing why his dad never panicked around that divine creature. Zeus realized they'd journeyed so far just to see him, and guilt hit him hard for how plain his home looked. He wished he could have welcomed them with something way grander. Scott stared at the village like he couldn't believe his eyes, and asked what happened here since the last time he saw it. Third, Zeus straight up explained that 5 years ago a massive cave-in had slammed down at the Dion mine. Against all odds, everyone survived, though plenty were badly hurt. The mine got sealed shut, and once the supply route was cut off, more and more people kept fleeing the village. Village. Scott's jaw dropped in pure shock when he realized this had happened. Meanwhile, Bernie clocked something weird, and it hit him right then. It was the exact moment they first met out in the woods. He couldn't shake the weird feeling, like the mine disaster and their forest meeting were happening at the exact same time for a reason. Zeus admitted the villagers had been on edge from their brutal hardships and begged for forgiveness over how they'd treated him before. Then Scott smiled and told him, "It's all good, really." A woman hurried in with tea, but her face screamed with pain as she set it down. Scott let out a grateful breath, and she slipped away into the quiet without a sound. He kept replaying the same terrifying question in his head. Did she get hurt in that cave-in too? Zeus told her that just recently someone had found her sprawled near the forest, and she had no family, no home, and nowhere to go back to. He prayed they could keep rebuilding the village, leveling up the basics for everyone, and if things went right, maybe they'd finally get a doctor to move in and stay. As soon as Scott and Bernie heard that, they shot each other quick, knowing glances. With pride blazing in his chest, Bernie promised the old man he'd take care of the repairs, then bolted out the door. Zeus blinked in confusion. Scott let out a smug chuckle. He leaned in with total confidence and told the village chief straight up that his son was the only true master of magical tools. Bernie grabbed control, tore into the water pumps, and kept repairing them until they looked almost brand new. A few kids clocked him and started waving him over to the playground. Bernie snapped the seesaw back into place and sent the swing soaring. She swung her attention for a second, catching Bernie and the kids, then turned and walked off. Bernie clocked her, and a brand new idea ignited in his head like a spark catching fire. While Bernie threw himself into the repairs, Zalis couldn't stop gushing about how insane it was to watch the kid fix so much, so fast, and in a village this short on hands, that kind of help was a massive lifeline. Scott said he was just glad to step in and help the community. Zeus stared at him for a beat and said Scott had a sharp eye. Then Scott leaned in, demanding to know if he truly meant it. The old man finally clocked it. Scott wasn't there for a friendly chat at all. Scott had already figured the old man would see straight through his real motives. He didn't call Zeus the village's ruler. He treated him like a mentor who'd been there all along. Scott begged him to train him one more time. With a chilling glare, Zeus demanded to know why. Scott told everyone he had zero regrets ditching the life of an adventurer because forging steel gave him the purpose he'd been chasing. Smith finally snapped to the awful truth. His power wasn't enough to protect his family, and it hit him like a punch. He wanted to claw back the power he once had as an adventurer and get even tougher than ever. But somehow, his kids grew into people who could stand their ground, chasing their own dreams like the future is screaming for them. As their dad, he swore to shield them from every bit of danger. He begged his master for one more shot to finally get trained. Seeing how real his disciples were, Zealous flicked Scott's shoulder with a gentle tap. He said Scott had grown up into an amazing father while he'd been gone. And on top of that, he needed to repay a favor. No strings left untied. Scott finally exhaled with relief. Then the old man warned him that the training was going to crush him. Tough as nails. If Scott was still interested, he'd fire him up all over again. Again, Bernie stormed up to the injured woman from before, and she blurted out, frantic, asking what on earth was going on. Bernie blurted, "Sorry," just as he interrupted her. He showed up and told her, "I came because I heard you were hurting." She nodded, then admitted the villagers were kind, so somehow she was managing. Bernie suddenly remembered he still had some extra magic ore left over from crafting the staves. He told her he'd build a tool to help her heal, and the moment it landed, her mind just couldn't make sense of it. Bernie motioned for her to sit right down. He yanked out bandages, a chunk of magic ore, and a little bottle of potion. He blasted his power into the air, and then The sudden burst of bright light startled the woman, and in the blink of an eye, a solid shape snapped into existence. Bernie told her this would crank up her healing fast. Yeah, it wasn't true healing magic, but it would still smash the odds and push her leg's recovery forward. History? The woman blurted out heartfelt gratitude, like the moment mattered more than anything. Bernie even threw out the idea that he could slap the cast on her himself. Bernie didn't flinch at all. Those snake tattoos on her hurt leg were there, and she just shrugged like nothing could touch her. The woman beamed with one more burst of gratitude, then admitted she had nothing she could offer in return. Bernie flashed a grin and told her it was totally fine, thrilled he finally got to help her out. The woman paused for a beat, then snapped, asking why Bernie had come to their village in the first place. Right when he was about to answer, a sharp knock rattled the nearby window, and Scott stood outside, staring in. Bernie backed off, and the woman seized the moment to thank him again, like her heart couldn't let it go. She reached for more, but the moment she did, her smile died and darkness swept over her face. Outside, Bernie leaned in and demanded to know what was going on. Scott leaned in and told them the village had a food warehouse sitting right on the edge, then asked for help hauling the supplies over. Bernie and Al both shot back yes, and Zoo immediately lit up, thanking them for everything they'd done. Help! Those buildings looked worn out and exhausted, but at least the food situation had finally started to improve. Not long ago, a brand new lord took over the Dion area, and the very first thing he did was lock in enough food to keep everyone alive. The moment Scott heard that, he couldn't help wondering, was this new lord someone who actually mattered? Zealous nodded along, then painted the lord as the kind of dependable powerhouse who always put people first. The lord was out on an inspection, and when he finally returned, he smugly hoped Scott would come running to greet him. Scott shot back, "Yeah," because they were dead set on sticking around for a while. Out of nowhere, a voice snapped right next to him, yelling like it knew exactly where he was. Everyone bolted toward the village entrance, rushing like their lives depended on it. A blood-soaked, armored man dropped to his knees, begging his master for help like it was his last breath. He staggered forward, then face-planted hard right in front of the crowd. Bernie's eyes went wide when a blood-soaked soldier suddenly burst out of nowhere. There he froze, staring as the battered man begged anyone, pleading for help, right there in front of him. Scott clocked that the injured soldier still made it into the village, and he figured the fight must have happened right nearby. Zoo decided to ride out and rescue anyone still stuck in trouble, then told a nearby villager to watch over the soldier. Soldier. Scott shot back that they should split up the hunt for clues, then told Al to track the scent of blood. Zell leaned in and told them straight up he had a plan for where they were headed. And with that, the whole crew tore off together. They spotted a group far off in the distance, and it didn't take long to clock it. Zeus looked at the Lord's team and knew something was off, like the checkup went sideways and never got fixed. Bernie spotted a carriage lying on its side, overturned and abandoned. Zella blurted out that it belonged to the Lord, and panic hit them hard, like they'd just walked into an ambush. Scott yanked out his knife and Al snapped, warning everyone that the sharp stench of blood meant danger was close, so they better keep their eyes open as they pressed forward. As soon as they reached the carriage, they spotted a towering beast goring the ground, its tusks slick with blood, while wounded soldiers lay scattered all around it. As soon as Bernie caught sight of that massive beast, then it hit him. An important truth, clear as day. Right when he was ready to think, the board barreled back at him, so Scott sprinted forward fast, trying to smash it down first. He vaulted over the boar and slammed a punch into the back of its head, one crushing hit that dropped the beast hard to the ground. The wounded soldiers just froze in shock, as if the world had hit pause. Stunned, Bernie stared in pure awe as his dad fought, and Zoo even clocked it. Scott landed the strike right on the perfect spot. But that boar wasn't some ordinary beast, it was something else entirely. Against all odds, it looked completely unscathed even after the assault, and snapped its body around to slam Scott off balance. Right as the creature lunged for Scott, something slammed straight through its head. Scott shot a glance over, and there it was. Bernie had fired the crossbow. And somehow the creature hauled itself back up again, while Bernie could feel that crossbow hitting harder than ever, and he knew this was his one shot to end it. He held his breath and prayed the shot would land, because this time he needed it to succeed. The creature went deadly silent, then slammed into the ground with a thunderous thump. Thump! Bernie let out a breath of pure relief, because his plan had actually worked. A young man strolled up to Bernie and dropped a bold compliment about how insanely great his performance was. Zeus's whole body loosened with relief the second he saw Lord Matthias was safe. Matthias told them they got ambushed on their way back from the inspection. Only a few guards stood between them and disaster, and the odds felt brutal. After his guard crushed the monster, a thick black cloud of smoke erupted, and then it slowly faded into nothing. Matthias couldn't shake what he'd just seen, and he finally had to admit it. Bernie had truly earned every bit of that proof. Bernie leaned in, dead curious about his words, and Matthias fired back, telling him everything about what happened in Rodney Valley and at the Royal Academy. I caught the way Bernie's name had blown up in the royal capital, and I never in a million years thought I'd run into him like this. Bernie snatched his hand and demanded to know who he was. Zeus said the kid was Matthias, the current lord of Stone Village and the second prince of the Ladover Kingdom. Matthias flashed that he was happy to meet them. Scott and Bernie just stared, stunned they'd run into a prince in the wild. Before they knew it, they were trailing behind him straight to the mansion where he was staying, right there on the edge of the village. Bernie's jaw nearly dropped. No way a prince should be living in a place that grand right out here. Matthias thanked them again for pulling them out of that terrifying mess, and Scott just shrugged it off, saying they were more than happy to help and that they'd back them up with the soldiers if things got rough. The prince thanked him for the offer, then told him he'd already handed the soldiers over to Zoe, so they'd be just fine. Bernie always pictured princes as hard and bossy. Then Matthias shows up, and somehow he's all kindness and real sincerity. Bernie couldn't help but wonder why Matthias had dragged them to his place. Matthias flashed a quick grin. Then his smile vanished. He straightened up and demanded their help. Scott and Bernie instantly felt uneasy, like something was seriously off. Matthias told everyone he had a bunch of hard-earned reasons for why he'd become the leader of Stone Village. Strange figures were slipping into and out of the forest right by the village, and everyone knew the kingdom's magic team was running the show, so he couldn't resist and decided to investigate. He basically said regular people should have found it almost impossible to slip into a zone guarded by magic cores, so if those reports are real, then that core was quietly letting shady folks through on purpose. And the probe in the forest, where the magical poison first appeared, has dragged on for 5 straight years with 0 answers, while the magic core members popping up during the Academy event only makes the whole thing feel even more off. When he charged into the forest to explore, danger lunged at him from every shadow. Bernie suddenly realized the earlier attack wasn't an accident, it was planned. Matthias whipped around to Ronville, his assistant, demanding a quick answer and a clear explanation. Ranville told them the massive creature lurking in Rodeo Valley wasn't supposed to be there at all. There, he heard that a monster had suddenly changed at the Academy, and on that very same day, he watched the prince get attacked. Their suspicions snapped into certainty. Matthias spilled the truth. The kingdom's magic team had summoned these giant monsters. Their job was to guard the forest's hidden secrets, no matter what it took. Those creatures in Rodney Valley and all over the Academy? Yeah, he was sure they were experiments, and he could feel it. Every single thing happening was tied together. Bernie couldn't believe a word he was hearing, and when he learned the magic core had tried to kill a prince, the shock hit even harder. Matthias flashed a sly, wry grin, like he already knew the punchline. Before they finally cracked the truth that the magic core's real plan was still a total mystery, a genius lurked near the nation's heart, powerful enough to steamroll the whole region, and he had a gut feeling it was someone nursing a deadly grudge against the royal family. He chased down Bernie for his opinion because he was itching to use Bernie's magical tools again, tools that had already saved the day in 2 past cases. But Bernie couldn't shake the feeling someone might be out there. With no experience at all, could he really juggle something this massive for the whole nation? Matthias caught the pain in his eyes as it all fought to break free. He remembered Bernie was the only magical tool engineer in the whole nation. And suddenly it clicked, like that role had been waiting for him for a reason. Why he was born as the second prince at all, because only he could carry the special duties no one else could touch. A scandal hit the air, and he refused to let it shake the country. He just wanted his people safe, so he pressed Bernie for answers. If he could help shield everyone else, too. He yearned for the day they'd team up, put their powers together to protect everything that mattered most to them. Bernie, a genius magical tool engineer, knew there were some threats only he could stand between. He had loyal friends by his side, and even more important, a loving family, and if his strength could help even a little, he was determined to share it without hesitation. In his old life, love never even showed up. In this brand new world, everyone around him just keeps showing him what love really means, so he steels himself and decides to help the second prince. Scott grinned, pride blazing in his chest, tighter than ever. Clenching his fist, he swore he'd jump in and lend his support too. Matthias shot both of them a grateful smile, thanked them, and then immediately shifted his focus to the next move. He admitted he wanted to supercharge his forces, then said he'd head straight back to the royal capital to reorganize everything. Bernie let slip that he had solid, trustworthy contacts in the royal capital, so who in the world could help him? And just like that, the woman with the snake tattoo on her right leg was fully healed again. She slipped into the forest alone, murmured a spell, and summoned a crow with magic. So she tied a note to its leg, then tossed it into the sky like a message on a mission. As she watched her friend sprint off, a grin burst across her face. Before anyone could blink, the school break kicked in, and Lucille bounced home like pure joy incarnate. She wanted nothing more than to crash land into a long, carefree break with her family, either hanging out together at home or hitting a fun getaway side by side. As soon as she arrived, she spotted her mom outside, hauling in piles of laundry, and Dorothy practically lit up as she greeted her with warmth. Lucille scanned the area and asked if everyone was inside, and when Dorothy said they'd all gone to Stone Village and wouldn't be back for a while, Lucille immediately shifted into action. Time dragged on, and Lucille couldn't shake the crushing disappointment of realizing the break with her family wasn't going to feel like she'd hoped. Family. Then Al barged in and froze, totally shocked to find her right there. Lucille shot forward and wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug, and Dorothy insisted he'd headed to Stone Village, while Al said he'd even gone back to the royal capital for work. And he'd be back at the village again soon. Only this time, he rushed in to tell them, straight up, it was going to take a while before everyone could finally go home. Home, when Lucille pressed him for why, he finally admitted that some things had gone down and they were scrambling to deal with the mess. That his message was getting messy and nobody could follow what he meant. So she figured, if I'm going to do this, I might as well hit Stone Village too, and straight up asked her mom if she could go. Dorothy let out a soft chuckle, waved them on, and sent them off with a big, heartfelt wish for good luck. At the exact same moment, Zach and Matthias locked eyes, tense, electric, like trouble was already breathing down their necks. Oh, Bernie's nerves were on fire, and the tension in the air felt like it could snap any second. Just moments ago, he'd hauled Matthias and Ronville straight to the Adventurers Guild. Now everything had gone sideways, fast. He suggested they sneak a look at the exclusive Kaguru group. Kiru. Ranville heard the name and instantly remembered. These guys were a legendary powerhouse team, famous in the royal capital, and if they joined forces, they'd become unstoppable allies for the second prince. Matthias couldn't hold it in. Pure adrenaline hit him the moment he thought about it. When Bernie swung the door open, he warned them about Zach's rough, tough face, but then he leaned in and insisted, "Trust me, he's actually nice." The moment they crossed into the hallway, Bernie caught the heavy tension in the air and couldn't help but start wondering what the hell went wrong. He yelled for Zach, and the second Zach saw him, he clocked him, and the guys posted by the door immediately. Zach locked eyes with him and barked, "Upstairs, come with me," his stare burning like a warning. Matthias perched on a stool while Zach glared at him from the sofa, and the other kangaroo members piled in right behind that same cold stare. The whole place went dead quiet. Then Matthias stepped in, broke the silence, and introduced himself in Ronville's. Zach snapped and demanded to know what that big shot from his country wanted from people like them, warning that if the answer went the wrong way, things could turn brutal fast. Ronville's rage surged, and he snatched his sword. Then he tore into Zach, calling him out for disrespect, warning him to watch every word or face the consequences. Zach finally dug in his heels and snapped that they didn't owe a single thing to rural folks who looked down on explorers. Then he spun to the prince and pressed, "So tell me, do you?" Matthias snapped to agreement the moment he was corrected, saying it was straight up unrealistic to demand manners from adventurers who survive by hauling in magical ore, then selling it to the country that's supposed to supervise them. Dude, Bernie finally clocked it. Things had gone horribly sideways, because he'd completely missed the truth that Zach didn't like the country at all. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, like something dangerous was about to explode. And you could feel that tension climbing, like the whole room held its breath. Matthias then straightened everything out and made it clear his earlier words were exactly the kind of thing royals usually say. He didn't just tolerate it, he truly adored every single person who threw their support behind the royal capital. He could practically see it. Adventurers hauling magic ore and supplies had the capital's economy roaring like never before. He demanded they treat him like an equal, no exceptions. Zach let out a heavy sigh and asked, right there, what the prince needed. Matthias shot out a hand toward Karoo, the legendary team adventurers couldn't stop talking about for their insane talent and jaw-dropping wins. Cliff, nerves jangling, leaned in and asked what kind of cooperation they were even talking about. Matthias spilled the newest clues about the magic core and the shadowy villain hiding somewhere inside the nation. Joseph stayed locked in on the belief that there was absolutely no reason to get involved. Matthias figured the whole problem had to be tied to magic drying up and resources running low. He couldn't just stand there and watch the royal capital fall apart while the citizens suffered through every brutal day. He snapped that the people in charge cared more about the nation than about the people, and that lit a fire under his skin. Then admitted he just didn't have enough power to change anything for real. So he demanded their help. He rose to his feet and bowed deeply, begging for their support. Ranville froze in shock and snapped that a king should never bow to regular people. Matthias leaned in close and barked at him to shut up. He said being a prince didn't mean a thing to him right then. To him, this was the only way to show respect, like a promise to his very soul. Zach was totally stunned. Then he burst into laughter. Surprising the whole room, he lit up and said he liked the idea, then decided on the spot to jump in. But one thing burned in his mind, so he turned to the prince. Matthias practically urged him to ask anything he wanted. Zach couldn't shake it, so he pressed him. Why did he feel he had to protect everyone? Mattia looked stunned for a split second, then snapped into action and fired back with a quick answer. Later, deep in the woods near Stone Village. He ended it with one brutal swing. As he stared at the damage in his own hand, it finally hit him. He had truly mastered the technique. Zillis couldn't believe it. Scott snatched it up in seconds. He swore it all came down to Scott's hard-earned adventure experience and his unmatched skill as a blacksmith. He pushed him hard to step up and be the kind of role model his sons could look up to. Scott nodded and agreed. He'd do it. After training finally wrapped, Zeus cut out on his own and headed back to the village. Once things settled, he asked Scott to come along, and Scott couldn't stop himself. He poured out his gratitude to his master. Then he stared up at the sky one last time before flopping down to catch his breath. Break. He could feel it coming, like the moment his efforts would finally land right where they should, and the next step would be tightening his precision. Just then, Zach showed up and started needling Scott about it. About how hard he was grinding, giving it everything he had. And the rest of the kangaroo crew was right there too. Scott blinked in shock. Zach actually agreed to the request, even though Scott never once thought he'd back the key players. Zach couldn't sit still after he found that magic and circulation link. Then it hit him even harder when he learned the royal capital was falling apart. After Matthias answered his question, he immediately locked in his next move. History. Matthias just wanted to know one thing. Did anyone out there really need a reason to look out for others? Zach watched Matthias's courage shine as a prince, and it hit him. Teaming up with him was too important to ignore. Scott said, "It's just like Zach," and Zach shot back. People our age only lock in on what matters to them. So yeah, adults should cheer them on from the sidelines. And then Cliff linked up with Kaguru while Lucille slid into Stone Village too, because she could use magic as well. Scott wore a sly little smile, like he knew something nobody else did. Now that Zach was calling the shots, the whole team felt unstoppable, ready to surge forward. Night had already fallen, yet the workers kept their boots moving, and the mines roared on as they pushed through every shift. Burning and the others dropped into a crouch behind the trees in the nearby forest, holding their breath as they waited. He shot a quick nod to the crew, signaling, "All right, let's move." Scott and the crew locked in, and Matthias and Ronville jumped right in too. They were done waiting. Now it was time to slam their plan into motion. Earlier, Matthias leaned in and spilled every gritty detail about the forest search to everyone. He said, straight up, that he'd rather dodge the magic core if there's any way. Then Ranville suggested they split up to hunt for the enemies. As the location stretched across that endless expanse, the moment Lucille heard it, she snapped into action and cast her magic. Because her detection magic would make it effortless. She fired it up to track people. Boom! A massive map lit up before her, and circles started popping all over it. Bernie clocked his sister's raw talent, and Ranville's eyes went wide when she unleashed that powerful magic. Lucille spotted a huge crowd packed deep in the middle of the forest, all gathered for something, fast. In the forest, right by the deep mine's entrance, she counted around 30, maybe even more, and she noticed the key members feeding off some spellbinding power, until Matthias finally understood exactly what they needed. To crack the truth, they had to grab the people who held the proof. But it was going to be a nightmare if those suspects bolted straight into the woods the moment they tried to snatch everyone at once. Bernie suggested they lay down some traps. He let out a chuckle as he reached into his magic bag and started yanking treasures out. Bag, swearing every bit he had packed could still come in clutch. Cliff leaned in and peppered them with questions about the enchanted ore and the ropes. Bernie unleashed his powers and forged a magical device in an instant. Zack leaned in and asked if this was the legendary magic device, while Scott couldn't help wondering how they'd even use it. Bernie told them to rope off the busiest areas with the special cord he'd crafted, because once they were trapped inside those lines, the targets couldn't slip away. Zack leaned in and told him, "Let your team handle the trap setup." Lucille pushed on to hunt down the perfect spot for the mine, and Scott stayed right beside her, acting like her living shield. Bernie pumped everyone up, urging them to go all in and leave nothing behind. Matthias flashed a grin at Bernie as the crowd thinned and spilled away. First, he said Bernie had a whole bunch of people he could count on no matter what. Right in the middle of the wait, Bernie suddenly stopped and paused, like a spark hit their mind. He kept waiting, then suggested they talk, thinking it'd be easier to open up to someone like him. Matthias shot him a warm thank you and patted his head softly. Then he made his decision. He was finally going to tell Bernie something big. As the king's health crumbled, Matthias and his brothers stepped up fast and took over even more of the government's heavy lifting. The moment the government decided, they handed the big key state matters to his brother, the future king, while Matthias, the second prince, was tasked with breathing new life into scattered regions. Their whole plan was cruising, until that magical poison burst onto the scene 5 years ago. As soon as they handed the case to the magical core, everything screeched to a halt. Then the no-go zone exploded outward after the cave-in. Because without his brother's consent, none of these moves would have happened at all. Matthias tried to meet him face to face, but his brother kept slipping away, dodging every attempt. Bernie was convinced the Crown Prince was behind the whole mess. Matthias was sure his brother would never do anything to hurt the king, because he'd been around him long enough to know his heart, and still, it felt weird as hell. Matthias prayed his brother's moves weren't real, like someone was yanking his strings like a marionette. When Bernie realized Matthias had a chance to get targeted, his stomach dropped, because the idea of it happening felt truly heartbreaking. Attacked, Matthias snapped that it wasn't true. He admitted he didn't have the courage to face the truth, that his brother might have been able to change. It slammed the whole nation, and it crushed him. He hated that he'd turned it into a family fight. Bernie admitted he'd been wrestling with tough ideas, but he still chose to trust his brother. Matthias nodded like he understood, saying faith was the only thing holding him up. Bored. Bernie clocked that dodging regret mattered to him more than anything. Trusting someone was the bravest power a person could ever give. He was sure the Crown Prince trusted Matthias too, because this family bond was unbreakable, and nothing could ever replace it. Matthias nodded and told him straight up that he needed to trust his brother. No matter what his brother chose or what role he stepped into, they stepped into the fight together, and no matter what, they'd always be family. Now Bernie shot Matthias a worried look. He was sure Matthias loved family the same way he did, so he clinched his resolve, trusted in them with all his heart, and vowed to keep them safe while he pushed himself to give everything he had. Right then, Zack shot a signal to everyone. The men posted by the mine entrance demanded their names, and said they couldn't talk because they were knee-deep in something urgent. Massive piles of magical ore were scattered everywhere, like the world had been dumped on with power. The second Cliff clocked it, he knew they were burning through their resources for real. Randall warned the crew the mines were off limits, then caught them mining illegally anyway. The men snapped that they had jobs to do and were just following orders. Then they told the group to back off, because if they didn't, they'd get hurt. Matthias winced as he asked who hired them and how long they'd been toiling in those mines. One of the guys lunged at him, trying to take him down. Ronviel drove his fist into the man's face, warning him to back off Prince Matthias and remember his place. The moment he stepped in, the other miners came charging in, shouting that no kids belonged in those mines. To everyone's shock, Matthias stood his ground and handled it like a pro. Petty even took down the little thing and muttered, "Sorry for acting childish." Zach and Scott even wiped out a bunch of the miners too, but Scott grumbled that it was way too much, and Zach shot back that it was the perfect way to kick things off. More miners came running the moment they heard the commotion, and one of them shouted that the pay wasn't worth it before trying to bolt. They tried to flee, but Lucille's magic slammed the escape shut. She just snapped, "You're slow," like that was the whole story. A handful of miners playing the shadows tried to slip out and vanish before anyone caught on. Bernie's stomach churned with anxiety, but Al shot him a reassuring look and told him they'd already laid traps in that spot. The runaway miners tripped over the ropes, and total shock slammed into them. They crashed down, one after another, like trapped bugs yanked into a snare. Right there, Bernie finally exhaled. Those traps had done exactly what they were built to do. Lucille then blurted that they'd finally cleared the whole area. He took one look at the area and pushed them to head straight into the mine. They pushed deeper into the mine, and Matthias nearly laughed with relief. Now they just had to snag the proof before the workers slipped away. Proof. At that exact moment, Lucille sensed even more people closing in around her. They were close now, and the moment they realized it, they blurted the news and set everyone on alert. Right out of nowhere, a woman they instantly recognized stormed up to them, her face full of pain. It hurt like hell, and it turned out to be the very same woman he'd seen earlier. Bernie's jaw dropped the moment he clocked her. Then he couldn't stop wondering why she'd come back to the mines, or how she ended up getting hurt. She shot over and dropped to her knees beside him. He blurted out that her child was still locked inside, and they had to burst in and rescue them. Hearing that, Scott and Bernie locked eyes, then took off, and plunged deeper into those shadowy tunnels, pushing farther into the dark. She said the men probably hit him with a spell to scramble recognition, but even with her gift for exploring, she still couldn't find a single trace of them. She told them the men had spotted her gift, and then basically ordered her to hunt down precious magical ore. Scott remembered the village chief saying they'd found a woman lying unconscious right near the village. She swore she'd barely made it out alive, then swallowed her pain and stayed silent, because she refused to let anything she feared reach the village. Threat. Bernie swore that her old leg injury flared up because of that escape. But Ronviel couldn't shake the question. Why did she turn around and come back, after she'd already slipped free? Matthias caught the tension in his assistant's voice, then locked eyes on the tattoo, and knew exactly who the woman was. She burst into tears and admitted it. Those men had stolen her child meant for the royal capital, and they were using that kid as a leash to drag her back into the mines. She told me they warned her if she didn't come back, that kid would die. She came back and said the kid was pushed even deeper inside, and she couldn't pull him out alone, no matter how her leg healed after the enchanted device helped her. Defend herself, and the woman ushered the whole group into a massive open space deep inside the mine. She pushed them on just a little farther. Right at that exact moment, everything snapped into place. Matthias yanked his sword from its sheath and thrust the tip straight. A blade kissed the woman's throat, and she froze in place. And just like that, everyone around her froze mid-breath, staring in total confusion at what was happening. Matthias snapped that even if she changed her looks perfectly, that bruise on her leg would still give her away, and the moment she heard it, anxiety surged as she demanded what he meant. He revealed that in the royal palace, someone had the same bruise, and that a magician known for swapping faces was right there as Minister Zolan's assistant. He leaned in and told me her name was Eridian Crawford, the minister's secretary. She stopped dead for a heartbeat. Then, the moment her face shifted, she knew it. He'd seen right through her, and the annoyance in him had been simmering ever since she nearly pulled the trick on them. Ranville nearly froze when he clocked her in disguise. Bernie finally saw the truth. Every bit of it was a setup, a straight-up deception. Odin demanded to know if they were truly curious about her motives, and she snapped back that she meant to wipe them out for meddling with Zolan and prying into things that weren't any of their business. That snapped Matthias into the truth. Zolan really was tangled up in all of this. Aridina said it was fine to share because she planned to get rid of them anyway. Then she called it her little farewell gift before they charged onward to the next life. She finally spilled the truth. She'd been the one calling the shots, overseeing those men as they ripped the powerful magic ore out of the ground. When Matthias took the throne, she had to vanish her true identity and stay on top of every move in the village. All she had to do was sketch them in and finish the job, because if they stayed oblivious, their end would come fast, and almost painless. She snapped that they were unfortunate, then laughed in Matthias's face, mocking him for not seizing the crown and for leaning on a young friend who kept wasting time worrying over minor injuries. Bernie asked about the kid, and she told him the child had already been taken. Auditine double-checked the numbers and snapped, "Yep, that's exactly right." She flicked her fingers and the ground ripped into a violent tremor. A colossal snake monster surged up from the dark depths, breaking the surface like a nightmare made real. Lips, her proud offspring, the one she swore came from her. She ordered it to devour every last one of them, as the beast slammed into Bernie and the others. Zack calmly ordered everyone to clear out and give him space. Cliff and the crew burst inside, and they went straight at the monster in brutal battle. Monster roared, and he pushed through anyway, landing the hit and finally wounding it. Bernie pushed them to keep going meanwhile. Joseph clocked something strange. Walls snapped up around the snake creature like a trap closing. Cliff's attack lost its bite mid-swing and slammed him backward instead. Lucille watched the monster summon a shield out of its own power, and the way it did it stunned her. Aridine let out a sharp chuckle and flat out said cutting the monster was a waste of time, calling their whole attempt nothing but silly. Silly or not, Zack decided to strike back, and right as the choice hit, the creature came sprinting straight at him. Then he snapped a punch through, smashing straight into the head. He smashed in hard and straight. Then the creature hit the ground with a brutal thump. And... Aridine! Tell them to hang on, just for 1 second. Then Ranville ignored it and slashed at her with his sword, but she snapped out of the way at the last second, barely dodging the hit. Just before it landed, the blade nicked her cheek. Ranville begged her to stay calm, but Audine snapped back, calling him a stiff servant and groaning about how arrogant and irritating he always was. Right then, the snake creatures surged up again. Zack leaned in like, "Whoa, that's actually intriguing." A creature snatched something up and clenched it in its mouth. Lucille sensed danger instantly and yelled for everyone to back up right now. The creature blasted a roaring stream of fire, and in seconds, everyone realized, no doubt, it wasn't just heat, it was pure flame. Fire exploded all around them, flames snapping shut into a blazing trap that swallowed everyone. Crap, Joseph warned them that if the flames kept swelling in that cramped spot, they wouldn't last long. Still, Lucille spotted a silver lining. Now they'd cracked the monster's one deadly trait. She hurled her ice magic and instantly sealed the giant snake in a wall of freezing frost. But the creature's brutal heat blasted the ice away, melting it in a blink. She and Joseph locked eyes and knew they had to invent a whole new strategy right now. Bernie didn't just disagree, he slammed the idea down. This wasn't some we're out of options moment, because there was still a ton of valuable magic to go around. But to pull off his technique, they had to lock the monsters in place and command the flames. Al warned them that the entrance was getting slammed shut by crashing rubble. With the heat cranking up, Bernie realized they were running out of time fast. Right on time, Lucille and Cliff clapped reassuringly on his back, like they were steadying him before the next hit. They demanded he step back, begging him to let them deal with the flames, and swore they'd buy him time if it turned ugly. They promised him right then and there that they'd stand by him and back him up for that exact purpose. Bernie knew he had to move at lightning speed. He had his friends right beside him, and he demanded their backing.